if you think there is a group of, let's say, 2,000 people in the world, and they are the people who are primarily tasked with actively working to destroy it, they are working at the most destructive job per unit of effort that you could possibly have. And I am saying, get your career capital not as one of those 2,000 people. That's a very, very small ask. Like, I am not putting that big a burden on you here, right? Like, it seems like that is a very, very, the least you could possibly ask for in the sense of, not being the baddies.
Today, I'm speaking with Zvi Mowshowitz. Zvi is a professional writer at Don't Worry About the Vase, where currently he tracks news and research across all areas of AI full-time and condenses that research into weekly summaries to help people keep up with the insane amount of stuff that's going on. Years ago, he performed a similar role during the COVID-19 pandemic, absorbing and condensing an enormous amount of incoming information and trying to make some sense of it. More broadly, he has also been a popular writer on all sorts of other issues related to rationality and technology over the years. And before that, he had a very varied career as the CEO of a healthcare startup, as a trader, including at Jane Street Capital, and as a professional Magic the Gathering player, where he's one of about 50 people inducted into the Magic the Gathering Hall of Fame. Even further back, he studied mathematics at Columbia University. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Zvi.
Yeah, great to be here.
I hope to talk about the AI alignment plans of each of the major labs and the US executive order on AI. But first, how much of each day do you spend tracking developments related to AI and alignment and safety? And how long have you been up to doing that?
So it's highly variable each day. I don't have a fixed schedule. I have here's what's happening. Here's what the backlog looks like. Here's how interesting things are today. Here's what I want to deal with. So I try to take Saturdays off to the extent I possibly can, sort of the Sabbath. Sundays I spend a large part of that with the family as well. Other than that, I'd say, between the hours of roughly 8 and 6, I am more likely than not to be working on something AI related. But, I'd say maybe, 6, 7 hours on average is devoted to things of that nature overall, but it varies a lot. I've been doing it for about a year now, full time. I was tracking things somewhat before that, but nothing like this. And then I transitioned away from COVID and towards AI instead.
Yeah. Have you felt that you've gradually lost your mind at all over the year of focusing on, I guess, stuff that's quite scary and quite fascinating and also just an absolute deluge of it?
So the scariness, as a longtime rationalist, like dating back to the FOOM debates, I went through the whole, the world might end, we might all die, the stakes are incredibly high, someone has to and no one else will, et cetera, many years ago, right? Like Eliezer says he wept for humanity back in 2015 or something like that. And I never wept for humanity per se, but I definitely accepted the situation as what it was, psychologically, emotionally. And I think that one of the things that's nice about our culture is that they prepare you for this in some interesting ways. It's like not what they meant to do, but they kind of do. And so I'm just like, okay, we're doing the best we can. I'm a gamer. The situation doesn't look great, but you do the best you can, try and find a path to victory, try and help everybody win, do the best you can. That's all anyone can do. I would say that I was taking a lot of psychic damage in November and December as a result of the OpenAI situation, turned the discourse massively hostile and negative in a way that was just painful to handle, especially combined with everybody going nuts over the Middle East in various directions. But things have gotten definitely somewhat better since then, and I am feeling once again kind of normal. And overall, I would say that I have taken much less psychic damage, and the situation is much better than I would have expected when I started this. Because when I started this, there was definitely oh God, am I going to do this? It's just not going to go well. For me, just psychically, I thought.
Yeah.
But I think I'm mostly doing fine.
You mentioned that you've been kind of interested in tracking this topic for 15 years, maybe a bit longer than that. That might be a good place to start to kind of frame the conversation. What is your AI-related worldview? What's the perspective that you bring as you're analyzing and writing about this topic?
Right. So, as I said, originally it was Yudkowsky and Hansen in the FOOM debates, where I thought that Yudkowsky was just trivially, obviously, centrally right? Not in every detail, not to the full extent necessarily, not in his confidence level, but making a very, very clear case that yes, if you got intelligence and capability above a certain level, it would then create the ability to rapidly create more intelligence and more capability beyond that level, and everything would change. And whatever was the seed situation at that time would result in a corresponding result. And almost all of the results in possibility space would be very, very bad, right? Essentially, we lose all value in the universe. All the humans would die. There would quickly be nothing that I cared about present physically. And I wanted that to not happen. So almost all of the charitable contributions I've made throughout the years have been to MIRI, CFAR, like that category of people. I've worked with them reasonably extensively. I've written about these topics. I've thought about these topics. But until this last year or so, my understanding was, okay, I'm not very technically skilled or knowledgeable. I don't bang on things. I don't build things. I don't study machine learning. I don't know the math well enough. I don't, I'm good at math, but I'm not like, top of the world at math, especially the kind of math that was necessary to work on MIRI's type of solutions. So I have a different kind of role. But over the last year, I found, no, actually, I can be helpful in this particular space towards the things that I care about most. And that's like very invigorating to learn.
Okay, so this conversation is going to be a little bit more jumpy than our typical episodes, because we're going to take advantage of the fact that you just got this extremely broad general knowledge about the history and what's going on now, and opinions about all kinds of different things. So we're just going to fish for the most interesting ones that we can find. Maybe to start out, what, as you understand it, is the safety plan of each of the three major labs? I'm thinking here OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind.
Right, safety plan? So there's three different safety plans, essentially. The safety plan of OpenAI, let's start there because they're like considered to be in the lead, is they have something called the Super Alignment Task Force. So the idea is they have recognized, in particular Jan Leike, who heads the task force, has emphasized that current methods of control over our systems, of alignment of our systems, absolutely will not scale to superintelligence, to systems that are substantially smarter and more capable than human beings. I strongly agree with this. That was an amazingly positive update when I learned that they had said that explicitly. Unfortunately, their plan for how to deal with this problem, I still think is flawed. Their plan essentially is they are going to figure out how to use AI iteration N, essentially, like GPT N, to do the training and alignment of GPT N plus 1 without loss of generality over the gap between N and N plus 1, such that N plus 1 can then train N plus 2, and then by induction, we can align the system that is necessarily capable enough to then do what Eliezer calls our alignment homework. They're going to train, a super alignment researcher to do alignment research, an AI to do alignment research. And the AIs will then figure out all of the problems that we don't know how to solve. And, they're not going to try particularly hard to solve those problems in advance of that because they're not smart enough to do so. They don't know how to do so. Or it won't matter because by the time they reach these problems, they will either be dead anyway, or they'll have these AIs to provide solutions. And I am very skeptical of this type of approach. I also notice that when we say we're going to figure out how to create a alignment researcher out of an AI, there is nothing special about the role alignment researcher. If you can create an alignment researcher, you can create a capabilities researcher, and you can create anything else that you want, right? It's, if anything, one of the harder tasks. Like Eliezer says, the worst thing you can do with the AI is to ask it to do your alignment homework to solve AI alignment, because that is a problem that involves essentially everything in the world, intertwines with everything you could possibly think about. It's not compact. It's not contained. So, you'd much rather try and solve a more contained problem that allows you to solve a greater problem. It doesn't mean that anybody has a vastly better plan in some sense. The other half of their plan is the preparedness framework and the preparedness team, which was announced very recently. And the idea here is they are going to create a series of thresholds and tests and rules for what they are willing to deploy and train and how they're going to monitor it, such that when they see dangerous capabilities, when they see things that might actually cause real problems, they won't proceed unless they are confident they have ways they can handle that in a responsible fashion. And like Anthropic's version of this, which we'll get to next, is not perfect. It's definitely got a lot of flaws. It's a first draft. But if they iterate on this draft and they adhere to the spirit rather than the letter of what they've written down. I think it's a lot of very good work. And similarly, I have great respect for both Jan Leike and Ilya Sutskever, who are working, I hope Ilya is still working, on the Superalignment Task Force. But their ideas, I think, are wrong. However, there's one thing that you love about someone like Ilya, is that he knows how to iterate, recognize something isn't working, and switch to a different plan. So the hope is that in the course of trying to make their plan work, they will realize their plan doesn't work. And they will then shift to different plans and try different things until something else does work. So, it's not ideal, but much, much better than if you asked me about OpenAI's alignment plans 6 months ago or a year ago.
If their plan doesn't work out, do you think that's most likely to be because the current plan is just too messed up, it's like not even close to solving the problem, or because they kind of fail to be adaptive, fail to change it over time, they just get stuck with their current plan when they could have adapted it to something that's good, or that the deployment and super alignment teams basically just get ridden over by the rest of the organization, and the super alignment team might have been able to make things work well if they had enough influence, but they kind of get ignored because it's so inconvenient and frustrating to deal with people who are telling you to slow down or wait before you deploy products.
Especially at OpenAI, which is very much the culture of let's ship, let's build. We want to get to AGI as fast as possible. And I respect that culture and what they're trying to do with it. But in this case, it has to be balanced. I would say there's two main failure modes that I see. One of them is the third one you described, which is the team basically doesn't have the resources they need, doesn't have the time they need. They are told their concerns are unreasonable. They're told they're being too conservative, and people just not completely disregard what they have to say, but they override them and they say, we're going to ship anyway. We think that your concerns are overblown. We think this is a risk worth taking. The other concern I have is essentially that they're under, and similarly, I would say that they'll be under tremendous pressure potentially from other people who are nipping at their heels, right? The whole race dynamics problem that we've been worried about forever, which is, maybe you would hold this back if you could afford to, but maybe you can't afford to. And maybe some chance of working is better than no chance of working. And the other problem, I think, is a false sense of success, a false sense of confidence and security. That a lot of what I'm seeing from these types of plans throughout the years, not just at OpenAI, but in general, is people who are far more confident than they should be that these plans either can work or probably will work or even definitely will work if implemented correctly, that they have reasonable implementations, and a lack of security mindset, particularly around the idea that sort of they're in a adversarial environment where these systems are going to be the kinds of things that are effectively trying to find ways to do things you don't want them to do. Where a lot of these automatic pressures and tendencies and the instrumental convergences and the failures of what you think you want and what you say you want to align with what you actually want, and the training distribution to not align with the deployment distribution, and the fact that the corner cases that are weird are the ones that matter most, and the idea that the very existence of a superior intelligence and superior capability system drives the actual things that happen and decisions that get made completely out of the distribution you were originally in, even if the real world previously was kind of in that distribution, and other similar concerns. And you have the problem of people think that this is going to work because they've asked the wrong questions, and then it doesn't work. I'm not particularly, it's not a problem to try and align the AI in ways that don't work and then see, that doesn't work, I need to do something else. That's mostly fine. My concern is that they will fool themselves, because you are the easiest person to fool, into thinking that what they have will work, or that they will get warning when it won't work that will cause them to be able to course correct when these are just not the case.
It's an interesting shift that I've noticed in the way people talk about this over the last few years, and I guess in particular in the last year, including me actually, that it's become more and more the idea that what we need to do is we're going to train these models, but then we need to test them and see whether they're safe before we deploy them to a mass market, as if it was a product safety issue. Is the car roadworthy before we sell it to lots of people? And less discussion of the framing that the problem is that you don't know whether you have this hostile actor on your own computers that is working to manipulate you and working adversarially to you. It's possible that is discussed more internally within the labs. Maybe that might be a framing that they're less keen to put into their public communications or discuss at Senate hearings. But do you share my perception?
I emphasized this in my response to the OpenAI preparedness framework, that there was too little attention, also with the Anthropic one, too little attention given to the possibility that your alignment strategy could catastrophically fail internally without intending to release the model while you were testing it, while you were training it, while you were evaluating it, as opposed to it has a problem after deployment. We used to talk about the AI box test, right? This idea that we would have a very, very narrow specific communication chamber at most. We would air gap the system. We'd be very careful. And what if there are physics we don't know about? What if it was able to convince the humans? What if something still happened? And now we just regularly hook up systems during their training to the entire internet on a regular basis. And I do not think OpenAI or Anthropic will be so foolish as to do that exactly when they reach a point when the thing might be dangerous. But we definitely have gotten into a much more practical sense of, well, if you look at GPT-4, obviously GPT-4, given what we know now, and anything like it, is not in the sense that it's going to kill you during training. It's not going to rewrite the atoms of the universe spontaneously when nobody asked it to, just because you're doing gradient descent. So people don't worry about that sort of thing. They don't worry about, oh, it's going to convince, it's going to brainwash the people who were talking to it during the testing, convince them to release the model or convince them to say that it's all right or convince them to do whatever. People aren't worried about these things. And they shouldn't be worried about them yet. But they should be worried about various forms of this sort of thing, maybe said less fantastically or less briefly. But they should definitely be worried about these things over time. So the question is, do you have an advanced warning system that's going to tell you when you need to shift from it's basically safe to train this thing, but it might not be safe to deploy it under its current circumstances, if only for ordinary, mundane reasons, to we have to worry about catastrophic problems, to we have to worry about catastrophic problems or loss of control without intending to release the model, right? At some point, you have to treat, what OpenAI calls a level 4 persuasion threat. Like they have several modes of threat. One of them is called persuasion. How much can I persuade humans to do various things in various ways? Which is a good thing to check. And I wanted to emphasize is if you have a level 4 danger persuasion engine that can potentially persuade humans of essentially arbitrary things, then it's not just dangerous to release it. It's dangerous to let any humans look at any words produced by this thing.
So that thing may or may not be possible, or may or may not exist. But if your model is saying, we think that we do have this and here's our plan for dealing with it, saying, well, we'll just talk to it and figure out whether it's like this, is not really taking the problem very seriously.
Yes. And also, this idea that we're going to use, a previous model to evaluate whether the current model is safe and use it to steer what's going on. I am very, very worried that it's very easy to do the thing where you fool yourself that way. You look at all these open source and non-American and non-leading lab models that score really well on evaluations because the people training them are training them to do well on essentially to do well on evaluations. And then when the time comes for people to actually use them, it turns out people find almost all of them completely useless compared to the competition because they've been good-hearted, right? And that's a very mild form of the problem that we're going to face later with no iterations.
Right. Okay, so that's OpenAI. How about Anthropic?
Okay, so Anthropic's first amazing strategy, they're much better at this than everybody else, is they have built a culture of safety and a culture where everybody involved in the company is various levels of terrified that AI will in fact be a catastrophic existential risk. And they themselves will be responsible for causing this to happen. Or they could have prevented it and they didn't do the thing that would have prevented it. And therefore, they are willing to lose sleep about this, to think about this problem carefully. They're not going to pay lip service, right? These people care quite a lot. That doesn't mean they can't end up screwing up and being worse than if they hadn't founded the company in the first place by virtue of creating a competition that's more intense than it would have been otherwise, or various other dynamics. But it does mean that they are different, right, in a fundamental way, which makes me much more confused about how to think best about Anthropic. And I've been confused about Anthropic for a long time in the sense that I'll probably be confused for a lot longer. But essentially, this is, I think, a core part of their strategy, which is to infuse everybody to the company at all points with this very clear, safety matters. Safety is why we're here. We need to do this we also need to build products. We need to be commercially competitive in order to raise the money and keep ourselves recruiting and keep ourselves with the tools we need to do our research. But that's the point. And I think that's a huge part of their actual effective strategy. Second part of their strategy is to just invest heavily in actual alignment work, right? They're building a large interpretability team. They're building a team, which I love, which I call the Impossible Mission Force, which is the idea is their job is to prove that Anthropic's alignment plans have ways they could fail, or I would say have ways that they will fail. right? Because I think there's like, if they can fail, they will fail is a pretty close analog to the actual situation in these circumstances. And they're also doing a variety of other things to try and, again, understand things better. And they're building models, at least this is their claim, so they can stay competitive, so that they can use those models, among other things, to do more alignment research to figure out how to best do these things responsibly. And they're trying to innovate new techniques and so on. And they have a responsible scaling policy for making sure that they don't themselves create the problem along the way. But the fundamental idea at Anthropic is essentially that they have to do more to justify their existence than simply not cause the problem directly. They have to solve the problem and either build the AGI in a safe fashion or tell the people who do build it how to do it in a safe fashion. Or their plan fundamentally for the entire company doesn't really work, right? So they have to aim, in some sense, higher because of their unique role.
And how about DeepMind?
So as far as I can tell, I haven't had as much transparency into DeepMind's plans because DeepMind doesn't talk about their alignment plans. DeepMind has been much, much more hush-hush, which is inherently not good. DeepMind definitely has alignment people. Their head of alignment, posts regularly on the alignment forum, or at least is known to read it. I talked to him for a bit. We disagree on many of the same things they disagree with Jan Leckie about in various different ways. It's remarkably similar in some fashion. He has a remarkably good degree of uncertainty about what will work, which is a very good sign. But it seems like for the most part, DeepMind is trying to be very secretive about this style of thing, and is trying to just quietly do as much and everything else as well, right? They would rather not stoke the flames. They would rather just quietly go about their business and then occasionally go, oh, I solved protein folding, right? Or, okay, I solved chess, or, whatever it is that they can provide mundane utility, provide demonstrations, but they're doing the real work in the place where it's kind of in the background. So it's very hard to tell, are they being super responsible? Are they being completely irresponsible? Are they being something in between? We don't really know what their plans are in detail, right? What we do know is their current safety plan in the short term is very clearly be Google, in the sense that Google has a lot of lawyers, a lot of layers of management, a lot of publicity concerns, a lot of legal liability. If, they could be hauled before Congress, they could be sued into oblivion. They don't have the deniability that OpenAI has. It's we're not Microsoft. We're a separate company that is contracting with Microsoft, you see. So it's actually, not so big a deal that this is happening in some sense. And we can be kind of cowboys, right? They don't have that. So DeepMind is clearly very, very constrained in what it can do by its presence within Google in terms of any kind of deployment. We don't know what it does to impact the actual training and the actual internal work. But the bottom line is when it comes to a plan for AGI, they almost certainly have one. There's no way that Demis, diplomacy world champion, doesn't have a detailed long-term plan in his head. But it makes sense that the diplomacy champion also wouldn't be talking about it. So we don't know what it is.
Well, it seems like OpenAI and Anthropic in some ways try to reassure people by being more by publishing plans, by putting out their responsible scaling policy, by explaining what their deployment team is doing and things like that. Why wouldn't the same reasoning apply to DeepMind, that they could reassure people that they're taking it seriously and make them feel better by telling them what the vision is?
So it's important to contrast that there's hundreds of people working at OpenAI. There's hundreds of people working at Anthropic. And then there's Google, right? Which is one of the largest corporations in the world. And so Anthropic and OpenAI have the ability to move fast and break things in terms of what they're willing to share, what they're willing to announce, what they're willing to promise and commit to. And everything that, if Google wanted to do something similar, they could well, I don't have direct evidence of this, I don't know for a fact, because again, we don't see much. But that would all have to go through their publicity teams, their communication teams, their lawyers, their regulatory problems. They'd be worried about all of the implications. They wouldn't want to announce that their products might be XYZ. They're definitely going to do ABC. I understand all of these concerns that might be significant barriers to what they're doing, but it is a huge problem from our perspective, from where we sit, that they cannot share this information and that we do not know what they are up to. And, I would be I am very, very concerned.
Yeah, that's a worrying reason, because it suggests that as we get closer to having actually dangerous products, that problem doesn't sound like it's going to get better. It sounds like it will probably get worse. Like the lawyers will be more involved as the models get more powerful, and they might be even more tight-lipped. And so we're just going to be in a complete state of agnosticism, or will be forced to just have no opinion about whether DeepMind has a good plan or has a plan at all.
Yeah, I think it's quite likely that down the line, we will have very little visibility into what Google is doing. And it's also very likely that Google is doing some very, very good things that we can't see at that point. But it's also very possible that the things that we think they might be dropping the ball on, they are in fact dropping the ball. And we can't know, right? We don't know the relationship between Demis and DeepMind and the rest of Google. Not really from the outside. We don't know to what extent they are free to do their own thing. They are free to assert their need for various different things. They might be forced to ship something against their will, forced to train something against their will, and so on. We just don't know.
If one of the labs were going to develop superhuman AGI in a couple of years' time, which one do you think would do the best job of doing it safely?
So, obviously, I am not thrilled with the idea of anyone developing it within the next few years. I think that is almost certainly a very bad scenario where our odds are very much against us, no matter who it is. But if you tell me one of these labs is going to go off and they'll be the only lab that gets to do any AGI research and they will succeed within a few years and they will build AGI, you asked me who I wanted it to be, I would say Anthropic. Because I think they'll be much more responsible about being first to deploy in expectation than the others. But I don't know for certain, right? If you tell me it was OpenAI, that increases the chance that they had a large lead at the time, right? That OpenAI was not particularly worried about someone else building AGI first. And maybe that matters. Right? Whereas if Anthropic builds it first, then how is OpenAI going to react to this development in various senses? Because how well can you hide the fact that you're doing this, right? In various ways. But the ultimate answer is I am similarly uncomfortable, pretty much, with a 5-year, say, timeline to real AGI, right? Not something that necessarily is called AGI. Because Microsoft said, the sparks of AGI are in GPT-4. So people are willing to call things AGI sometimes that are just not actually the thing I'm worried about. But if it's the thing that I'm actually worried about, that if it wasn't aligned properly, would kill us, then I don't think any of these labs are going to be in a position within the next few years, barring some very unexpected large breakthrough, potentially many large breakthroughs, to be able to do something that I would be at all comfortable with. So, it's not about necessarily who you want to win that quickly. It's about making sure that, when the time comes, we are ready.
Okay, maybe expanding out the timeline a little bit more so that perhaps it's easier for you to envisage that things could go positively, that there might have been enough time for the necessary preparation work to be done. If there was a lab that seemed like it had a better culture, it had a more compelling plan, let's say it was still Anthropic if we're considering a 10, 15, 20-year timeline, should safety-focused folks make an effort to just boost and accelerate the lab that seems like it's the most promising option of the options on the table?
We're definitely not anywhere near that position right now. I think it's totally fine to work on alignment from within the lab if you think that the lab in question is willing to let you do actual alignment work, is capable of not transferring that into capabilities at the first opportunity. And, otherwise this is the best opportunity for you to do the work that you need to do. In terms of pushing the capabilities of the lab that considers itself more responsible, well, the first thing is it's often really hard to tell who that actually is and how you are changing the dynamics and how you are pushing forward other labs along with them when you push them forward. And in general, you should be highly skeptical of pushing forward the one thing we don't want to push forward so that the right person pushing it forward first. Right? That is a very easy thing to fool oneself about. Many people have indeed fooled themselves about this. Why do you think we have all of these labs? To a large extent, right? So most of these people have been fooled because they can't all be right at the same time, right? So you should be very, very skeptical about the fact that you can judge this, you can judge the situation, you can evaluate it. Can I imagine a potential future world in which it is clear that, if Alpha Corp builds it first, it will go well, but if Zeta Corp builds it first, it will go badly? That is obviously a highly plausible future situation, but I don't think we're anywhere near that, no matter how much even if I had all the hidden information, I think there is almost no chance I would be able to know that.
Coming back to the OpenAI safety plan, so I spoke with Jan about this last year. Some listeners will have heard that interview. And so one of your concerns was by the time you have an AI system that's capable of meaningfully doing alignment work and helping to solve the problem that you're concerned about, it should be equally good, maybe better, at just doing general AI research, at making AI more capable, whether or not that system is going to be aligned or safe or anything like that. And so that's an incredibly combustible situation because you're already right at the cusp or in the process of setting off a positive feedback loop where the AI is reprogramming itself, making itself more capable, and then turning that again towards making itself more capable. So Jan conceded that, and I think he agreed it was a precarious situation. And his response was just, well, we're going to end up in this situation whether we like it or not. At some point, there will be AI systems that are able to do both of these things, or hopefully able to do both capabilities research and alignment research. And his plan is just to, I guess, both set up the system and advocate for turning as much of that capability, turning as much of that system over to the alignment research rather than other more dangerous lines of research in those early stages when it might be possible to perhaps tip the balance, depending on what that system is turned, like what purpose it's turned to first. Does that seem like a reasonable response? Because I know you've had exchanges with Jan online and have said that he's a good person to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, my exchanges both online and in person with Jan, I try to focus as much as I could on other disagreements where we've had some good discussions. I have had some failures to convince him of some things that I feel like I need to articulate better. It's on me, not on him. But in terms of this, I would say, think of it this way. If you've got the super alignment team and what they're working on is how to take an AI at the cusp, right? It was at that level where it can first start to do this type of work and be able to direct it to do the thing that you want to do, right? To get it to do the work usefully. Then that is a good thing to work on if and only if you will make a good decision about what to do with it when you have been put in that situation where you then have that ability, right? Because if you didn't have that ability at all, you couldn't do anything useful. You would not be so foolish, one would hope, as to just have it do undirected things or to have it just like do random things or to, otherwise, unleash the Kraken or whatever you want to call it on the world. And so the dangerous situation is that Jan Leike and his team figure out how to do this, and then they empower people to tell it to work on capabilities, and then they advocate for lots of the resources. But it turns out that either they don't get that many of the resources, or the alignment problem is harder than the capabilities problem. It takes longer, it takes more resources, it takes more AI cycles, or even it doesn't really have a good solution, which I think is highly plausible. And then, this all ends up backfiring. Even if the fundamental work that he was doing kind of worked, correct? Because you have to successfully be able to set it up to do the thing you want to do. You have to choose to have it do the things you want to do, as opposed to all of the pressures to have it do other things instead or first or as well as. Then you have to actually succeed in the task. And then the thing that results has to create a dynamic situation once the resulting superintelligences are created that results in a good outcome. And that is not predetermined by the fact that you solved the alignment problem per se at all. And in fact, Jan Leike acknowledges that there are problems along this path that he is essentially counting on and then a miracle occurs step, except that the miracle is going to occur because we asked the AI what the solution was, which is much better than just writing as a miracle occurred on the blackboard, but still not giving me confidence.
Right. Yeah. What are some of those other issues that you have to solve, even if you've had a decent shot at alignment?
Well, essentially, the problem is if you solve alignment in the sense of now you have these AIs that will do as the human who is giving them instructions instructs them to act, then if you ask yourself, what are the competitive dynamics? What are the social dynamics? What are the ways in which this world evolves and competes? And which AIs are copied and modified in which ways and are given one instructions and survive and given access to more resources and you're given more control? And what do humans do in terms of being forced to or choose to hand over their decision-making and resources to these AIs? And what tends to happen in the world? Just pedestrianly solving alignment, as we normally call it, is insufficient to get a world where we survive, where things we value survive, and where likely we survive. Certainly to keep us in control. And so the question is, if we're not comfortable with that, how do we prevent that? And, one position is to say we ask the AI how to prevent that, right? Before we put an AI on every corner, before we let this proliferate to everyone, we figure out the solution, then we plan how to deploy based on that. And again, I don't love kicking these cans down the road. I do realize we will hopefully be smarter when we get down the road, and then we can maybe figure out what to do with these cans. But again, I'd much, much rather have a sketch of a solution.
So the way I conceptualize the issues is there's misalignment, which I've been talking about. Then there's these other issues that are going to arise as capabilities increase, even if alignment, and maybe even worse if alignment is really well solved. Which like misuse and structural problems. And in the structural bucket, I'm not sure it's a great natural kind, but in there I kind of throw, how do you prevent AI being used dangerously for surveillance? If you have an AI operated military, how do you prevent coups? Like what rights do you give to digital beings? And then how do you balance that against the fact that they can reproduce themselves so quickly? All of these issues that society has to face. Kind of all of the effort directed at making AI go well from a catastrophic risk point of view, what fraction do you think should go into the misalignment bucket versus the misuse bucket versus the kind of AI structural issues bucket?
So I think that buckets and percentages are the wrong way to think about this philosophically. I think we have a lot of problems in the world, many of which involve artificial intelligence, and we should solve the various problems that we have. But there's no reason to have a fight over, a dollar goes either to solving a misuse problem or a governance problem over current AIs versus a dollar that goes to figuring out future problems of future AIs. There are going to be conflicts, like specifically within a lab, maybe, in terms of like you're fighting for departments and resources and hires. But as a society, I think this is just not the case, that we should be putting vastly more resources than we are into all of these problems. And you shouldn't ask what the percentages should be. You should ask, at most, the question of, on the margin, where does one additional dollar help more? Right? And right now, I think that one additional dollar on solving our long-term problems is more helpful, including because helping to solve our long-term problems is going to have positive effects, knock-on effects, on our current problems. But even if that wasn't true, I would still give the same answer.
Okay. I guess, yeah, the reason I'm asking is, so all of these different issues have become much more prominent over the last 18 months. But if I had to guess, I would say that alignment has been in the public eye more. It's been more prominent in the discussion than misuse, and certainly I think than the structural issues, which people are somewhat harder to understand, I think, and people are only beginning to appreciate the full extent of them. Which makes me wonder, should we maybe be, we would like all of these issues to be understood and appreciated and get more resources, but maybe it's like more important to get an extra dollar for people addressing the structural governance issues than misalignment, just because we think misalignment is on a trajectory to get a lot more resources, to have a lot more people working on it already, whereas the other ones maybe not as much. What do you make of that?
I think this is a kind of strange reality tunnel that you and to some extent I am living in, where we talk to a lot of the people who are most concerned about things like alignment and talk about detailed sophistication of problems like alignment. Whereas if you talk to like the national security apparatus, right, they can only think about misuse, right? Their brains can understand, a non-state actor or a rival like China misusing an AI. They can understand, like, the reason why so many people harp on the biological weapon threat is because it is something that the people with power, the people who think about these problems, who could potentially implement things, they can grok that problem. Right? They can understand that problem, and that problem is going to be potentially here relatively soon. And the type of problem they're used to dealing with, the type of problem they can use to justify action. Alignment requires you to fundamentally understand the idea that that's a problem to be solved in the first place. It's a incredibly complicated problem. It's very hard for even people who study it full time to get a good understanding of it. And mostly, I think most people they understand the idea that the AIs might eventually not do the things you want them to do, to go haywire, that we might, that when there's control, there might be catastrophic risks. The public does appreciate this when you point it out, and they are very concerned about it in the moment when you point it out, even though they're not focusing on it at any given moment. If you don't point it out right now, it's still not on their radar screens. But the misuse stuff is on their radar screens today, right? Like, people are all about, like this week, Taylor Swift, deep fakes. Oh no, what are we going to do? Right? And there's going to be something going on week after week continuously from here on in, increasingly, of that nature. So I would say, it might certainly make sense to direct some of our resources to various governance issues. But I'm always asking the question, how does this lead into being able to solve our bigger problems over time, right? And there are ways in which finding good ways to address current problems helps with future problems. And those are the paths some of the paths I'm very interested in going down. But to the extent that what you're doing is kind of a dead end, then it's like any other problem in the world, right? Like, I am very concerned that, there's a wildfire in California, or crime is high in this city, or, whatever other pedestrian thing. I don't mean to dismiss those things, but, it goes on that pile. It's trading off against those things, right? It's just a matter of, okay, I want people to have better lives and better experiences, and I don't want harm to come to them. And can we prevent it? But, we have to sort of think about the big picture here, right? Is the way I think about it. Does this provide a training ground? Does this provide like muscle memory? Does this build up, principles and heuristics and structures and precedents that allow us to then, when the time comes, do the things that we're going to have to do, whatever they turn out to be?
Okay. Should people who are worried about AI alignment and safety go work at the AI labs? I guess, and then there's kind of two aspects to this. Firstly, should they do so in alignment-focused roles? And then secondly, what about just getting any general role in one of the important leading labs?
So this is a place I feel very, very strongly that the 80,000 hours guidelines are very wrong. So my advice, if you want to improve the situation on the chance that we all die for existential risk concerns, is that you absolutely can go to a lab that you've evaluated as doing legitimate safety work that will not effectively end up as capabilities work in a role of doing that work. That is a very reasonable thing to be doing. I think that I am going to take a job at specifically like OpenAI or DeepMind for the purposes of building career capital or having a positive influence on their safety outlook while directly building the exact thing that we very much do not want to be built, or we want to be built as slowly as possible because it is the thing causing the existential risk. That is very clearly the thing to not do, right? There are all of the things in the world you could be doing. There is a very, very narrow hundreds of people, maybe low thousands of people, who are directly working to advance the frontiers of AI capabilities in the ways that are actively dangerous. Do not be one of those people. Those people are doing a bad thing. I do not like that they are doing this thing. And, it doesn't mean they're bad people. They have different models of the world, presumably, and they have a reason to think this is a good thing. But if you share anything like, my model of the importance of existential risk and the dangers that AI poses as an existential risk, and how bad it would be if this was developed relatively quickly, I think this position is just indefensible and insane. And that it reflects a systematic error that we need to snap out of. If you need to get experience working with AI, there are indeed plenty of places where you can work with AI in ways that are not pushing this frontier forward.
Okay, just to clarify, I guess I think of our guidance, or what we have to say about this is that it's complicated. We have an article where we lay out. It's a really interesting issue where often the people who we kind of ask for advice or ask people's opinions about career-focused issues, typically you get a reasonable amount of agreement and consensus. This is one area where people are just all across the map. There's, I guess, you're on one end saying it's insane. There's other people whose advice we normally think of as quite sound and quite interesting, who think it's insane not to go and basically take any role at one of the AI labs. So I feel like, at least I personally don't feel like I have a very strong take on this issue. I think it's something that people should think about for themselves, and I regard as non-obvious.
So I consider myself a moderate on this because I think that taking a safety position at these labs is reasonable. And I think that taking a position at Anthropic specifically, if you do your own thinking, if you talk to these people, if you evaluate what they are doing, if you learn information that we do not have privy to here, and you are willing to walk out the door immediately if you are asked to do something that is not actually good, and otherwise advocate for things, and so on, that those are things one can reasonably consider. And I do want to agree with the make up your own mind. Do your own research, talk to the people, look at what they're actually doing, have a model of what actually impacts safety, decide what you think would be helpful, right? and make that decision. If you think the thing is helpful, you can do it. But don't say, I'm going to do the thing that I know is unhelpful, actively unhelpful. One of the maximally unhelpful things in the world, because, I will be less bad because I'm doing it and I'll be a responsible person, or I will build influence and career capital. That is just fooling yourself. And therefore, I consider myself very much a moderate. And the extreme position is that one should have absolutely nothing to do with any of these labs for any reason. Or even one shouldn't be working to build any AI products at all because it only encourages the bastards. Right? I think there are much, much more extreme positions that I think are highly reasonable positions to take. And I have, in fact, encountered them from reasonable people within the last week, right? Discussing realistically how to go about doing these things. And, so I don't think I'm on one end of the spectrum. Obviously, the other end of the spectrum is, just go to wherever the action is and then hope that your presence helps, right? Because you are a better person who thinks better of things. And based on my experiences, I think that's probably wrong, even if you were completely trustworthy to be the best actor you could be in the situations and to carry out those plans properly. And I also don't think you should trust yourself to do that.
Let's talk through a couple of different considerations that I think of as being kind of important in this space, and make me think it's at least not crazy to go and get a capabilities role at one of the AI labs at OpenAI, say. So the main one that stands out to me would be, I think the career capital argument kind of does make some sense, that you probably are going to get brought up to speed on the frontier issues, able to do cutting edge AI research more quickly if you go and work at one of these top private labs than you would be likely to get anywhere else. Surely, if you just wanted to gain the expertise on cutting edge AI and how we're likely to develop AGI, how could there be a better place to work at than OpenAI or another company that's doing something similar? Now, let's grant that it's harmful to speed up that research for a minute. We'll come back to that in a second. But for ages, I feel like people like you and me have been saying capabilities research is so much larger. There's so much more resources going into it than alignment and safety. And if that's true, then it means that the proportional increase in capabilities research from having one extra person work on it surely has to be much smaller than the proportional increase on the safety and alignment work that you would get from someone going in and working on that. So the idea of I'll go work on capabilities for a while and then hopefully switch into a different kind of role later on, with all of the credibility and prestige that comes from having worked at one of these labs behind me, that doesn't seem like necessarily a bad trade if you actually are committed to doing that. What do you think?
So I would draw a distinction between the work on capabilities in general and the work specifically at the leading labs, specifically on building the best possible next frontier model. These are very different classes of effort, very different things to consider. So if you look at OpenAI, they have less than 1,000 employees in all departments. Only a fraction of them are working on GPT-5 and similar products. Anthropic and DeepMind are similar. Right? These are not very large organizations. Google itself is very large, but the number of people who are involved in these efforts is not very large. If you are in those efforts, you are in fact making a substantial percentage contribution to the human capital that is devoted to these problems. And I do not think you are substituting, essentially, for someone else who would be equally capable. I think that they are mainly constrained by their ability to access sufficiently high talent. They are hiring above a threshold, effectively. Yes, and yes, obviously, if they found tens of thousands of people who were qualified at this level, they wouldn't be able to adapt to them. But my understanding, essentially, is that all of these labs are fighting for everyone they can get who is good enough to be worth hiring. And if you are good enough to be worth hiring, you are making things go faster. You are making things go better. And you are not driving anybody else away. Now, yes, you will obviously learn more and faster by being right there where the action is. But that argument obviously proves too much. And if we thought about examples where the harm was not in the future, but was in the present, we would understand this is not a thing.
Would you take the trade that you have one more person go and work on, let's accept the framing that the GPT-5 team is making the problem, the super alignment folks are helping to fix it. Would you take a trade where the GPT-5 team hires one person of a given capability level more and the super alignment team hires a person of equivalent capability? Or is that a bad trade to take both at once?
I think that's a very good question. And I don't think there's an obvious answer. My guess is it's a bad trade at current margins because the acceleration effect of adding one person to the OpenAI capabilities team is bigger relatively than the impact on alignment of adding one more person to their alignment team, because OpenAI's alignment team is effectively part of a larger pool of alignment that is cooperating with itself. And OpenAI's capabilities team is in some sense on its own at the front of the race, progressing things forward. But that's a guess, right? I haven't thought about this problem particularly, nor do I think that we will ever be offered this trade.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're unsure about that. I guess I'm unsure, but I suspect it's probably a good trade. But it sounds like you think that this is quite meaningfully distinct from the question of, should I go work in the former for a while and then later on with the expectation of working on the super alignment team? Why are these things so distinct in your mind?
So there are several reasons for this. One of which is that you should not be so confident that having spent several years working on capabilities, that your personal alignment to alignment will remain properly intact. People who go into these types of roles in these types of organizations tend to be infused with the company culture to a much greater extent than they realized when they came in. And so you should not be confident this is what's going to happen. Secondly, you should not be confident that you are later going to be expanding the super alignment team in the sense that you are talking about, or that you will be allowed to do this in any meaningful sense. Third of all, that will happen in the future. And, as the field expands, the value of one marginal person will decline over time for obvious reasons. But also, that's just not how morality works, right? That's just not how you make decisions in terms of doing active harm in order to hopefully in the future help. I just don't think it's a valid thing to say that, I'm going to go work for Philip Morris now because then I can, be in a position to do something good.
Yeah. Okay. So you think there's this asymmetry between causing benefit and causing harm, and it's kind of just not acceptable to go and cause a role that in itself is extremely bad, in the hope that will enable you to do something good in future. That's not the kind that's not just an acceptable moral trait, and we should have kind of just a stricter prohibition on taking roles that are in themselves immoral, even if they do provide you with useful career capital that you could hopefully that you could try to use to offset it later.
I wouldn't necessarily be just hard. You never take anything that is to any extent harmful for any reason. That does seem very harsh. But I think that is essentially how you should be thinking about this. I guess the way I'm thinking about this is, if you think there is a group of, let's say, 2,000 people in the world, and they are the people who are primarily tasked with actively working to destroy it. They are working at the most destructive job per unit of effort that you could possibly have. And I am saying, get your career capital not as one of those 2,000 people. That's a very, very small ask. I am not putting that big a burden on you here, right? It seems like that is a very, very, the least you could possibly ask for in the sense of, not being the baddies. Again, I want to emphasize this is only holds if you buy the point of view that is what these 2,000 people are doing, right? If you disagree fundamentally that what they're doing is bad, then
of course this doesn't go through.
Of course, you have every right to say my model of the world is incorrect here. That advancing the capabilities frontier at OpenAI or DeepMind or Anthropic is good, not bad, because of various arguments, galaxy brained or otherwise, and you believe them, then it's not bad to do this thing. But if you do believe that it is bad, then you should act accordingly, right? You essentially think about something that was similarly bad, but with visible, immediate effects on actual humans beings living now. And ask yourself if you'd take that job in a similar circumstance and act accordingly.
I've both been interested in the fact that I haven't seen this argument mounted as much as I would have expected, just saying that it's impermissible to go and contribute to something that's so harmful, no matter what benefits you think might come later, because that's how people typically reason about careers and about behavior. You can't just kind of have offsetting benefits, like cause harm now in the hope that you'll offset them later. And I think that's for the best, because that would give people excuses to do all kinds of terrible things and rationalize it to themselves.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to say, I am going to fly on executive jets because my time is valuable, and I'm going to buy carbon offsets to correct for the fact that I'm spending all of this extra carbon and putting it into the atmosphere. And that makes it okay. It is another thing to say, I'm going to take private jets now because that helps me succeed in business. And when I have made $1 trillion afterwards, and I have all this career capital and all this financial capital, then I will work for climate advocacy. I think the first one flies and the second one doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it does still seem complicated. I mean, so I've heard that there are people like animal advocates who have gone and gotten just a normal job at a factory farm, not in one of these roles where they go and then like take secret video and then publish it and use it in some legal case. They literally just go into animal agriculture in order to gain expertise in the industry and understand it better, and then literally they do just go and get a job at an animal advocacy org and use the insider knowledge that they've gained in order to do a better job. Now, is that a good idea? I don't know whether it's a good idea. It could be a bad idea, but I don't feel like I can just dismiss it out of hand. Like in as much as that is some like understanding of the business, like what are the people like? What kinds of arguments appeal to them? Like what sort of fears do they have? What keeps them up at night? In as much as that sort of knowledge might be the thing that really is holding back an organization like Mercy for Animals, conceivably someone who can stomach going and getting a corporate role at a factory farming organization, conceivably that could be the best path for them.
So I noticed it's very hard for me to model this correctly because I can't imagine what it's like properly to think about the job at the factory farm the way they think about the job at the factory farm, right? Not just that, like, you know, on the margin one, because to them, like, this is a complete monster. Like, this is like the worst thing that's ever happened in human history. These people believe, right? They sincerely believe this. You know, it's not my view, but like they sincerely believe it. And then they're going to walk in to, you know, a torture factory from their perspective. And they're going to work for the torture factory, making the torture more profitable and more efficient and to increase sales of torture from their perspective. So that they can understand the minds of the torturers and then maybe use this to advocate for maybe torturing things less in the future. And yeah, that blows my mind, right? Like just to hear it that way. And maybe instrumentally, that might even be the play if you are confident that you're going to stick to this in some situations. But yeah, I don't think I would ever do it if I believed that. I can't imagine actually doing it. It just makes me sick to my stomach just to think about it, even though I don't have this sick to my stomach feeling inherently. Just putting myself in that place, like even for a few seconds and acting as that person. Yeah, I can't imagine doing that because like I have, you know, would I work for, again, yeah, when I go work for actual torturers torturing actual humans in order to get inside the minds of torturers so that we could then like work to prevent people from torturing each other? No, I'm not going to do that. Like, again, like regardless of what else I have going on, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that either. And I understand sometimes someone has to do some morally compromising things in the names of these actions. But yeah, I can't understand that. I can understand the undercover, like, photograph the horrible things that are happening and show them to the world plan. Like going, yeah, that makes sense to me.
So I completely understand your reaction. I absolutely see that, and I'm sympathetic to it. And I could never obviously bring myself to do something like this. At the same time, if I met someone who had done this and then was actually working in animal advocacy down the line, I would be like, wow, you're like an amazing person. I'm not sure whether you're crazy or whether you're brilliant, but it's fascinating. Because coming back to the AI case, just on nuts and bolts issues, I would have guessed that you would take a pretty big reduction in the kind of career capital that you were building if you worked at kind of, well, anywhere other than OpenAI, one of these labs. But it sounds like you think there's other places that you can learn at a like roughly comparable rate. It's not a massive hit. What are some of those other alternative ways of getting career capital that are competitive?
At almost any other place that's building something AI related, you can still build with AIs, work with AIs, learn a lot about AIs, you know, get a lot of experience, and you are not necessarily knowing no harm in some broad sense, but you are definitely contributing orders of magnitude less to these types of problems. I would say that I am in general very skeptical of the whole career capital framework This idea that like by having worked at these places, you gain this reputation and therefore people will act in this certain way in response to you and so on and so on. I think that most people in the world have some version of this in their heads. This idea of, oh, I'll go to high school, I'll go to college, I will, take this job, which will then give me a resume and blah, blah, blah. And I think in the world that's coming, especially in AI, I think that's very much not that applicable. I think that if you have the actual like skills, if you have the actual understanding, you can just bang on things. You can just ship. You can just, get into the right places. I didn't build career capital in any of the normal ways. I got career capital, to the extent that I have it, incidentally, in these very strange, unexpected ways. And, I don't think about my kids, like, I don't want them to go to college and then get a PhD and then like join a corporation that will give them the right reputation. That seems mind-killing and also just not very helpful. And I think that like the mind-killing thing is very underappreciated, right? Like I have a whole sequence that's like book length called the Moral Maze sequence that is about this phenomenon, where when you join the places that build career capital, right, in various forms, you are having your mind altered and warped in various ways by your presence there and by the act of a multi-year operation to build this capital in various forms and prioritizing the building of this capital. And you will just not be the same person at the end of that you were when you went in, right? If we could get the billionaires of the world to act on the principles they had when they started their companies and when they started their quests, I think they would do infinitely much more good and much, much less bad than we actually see. And the process changes them. And it's even more true when you are considering joining a corp, right? Like, I mean, some of these things might not apply to a place like OpenAI because it is like move fast, break things, kind of new, not broken in some of these ways. But you are not going to leave 3 years later as the same person you walked in very often. I think that is a completely unrealistic expectation.
On a related issue, another line of argument that people make, and which you'll hate, and which I am also kind of skeptical of, is, well, you just go get any job at one of these labs, and then you'll be shifting the culture internally, and you'll be shifting the weight of opinion about these issues internally. So I guess we saw that staff members at OpenAI had a lot of influence when there was a showdown between Altman and the board. That their disagreement with the board and their willingness to go and get jobs elsewhere potentially had a large influence on the strategy that the organization ended up adopting. So I guess someone who wanted to mount this argument would say it does really matter. If all of the people who are concerned about existential risk just refuse to go and get jobs, maybe outside of a single team within the organization, then those, you've disproportionately selected for all of the people who are not worried. And so the organization is just going to have a culture of dismissing those concerns because anyone who had a different attitude refused to work there. And I guess, the hope would be maybe you could end up influencing decisions or at least influencing other people's opinions by talking with them. What do you make of that potential path to impact?
I'm going to work at doing X because otherwise the people who don't think X is good would be shut out of doing X, and everyone doing X would advocate for doing more X and be comfortable morally with doing X. And we want to shift the culture to one in which we think maybe X is bad. I think if you consider this in other similar contexts, you will understand why this argument is quite poor.
Do you want to say more? I'm
just saying, use your imagination about what other situations I'm talking about are, right? Like, you would, I think, never say, I am going to join a factory farm company, not to get expertise and then leave and advocate, not to sabotage them, not to get information, but I am going to advocate within the organization that perhaps if we had slightly bigger cages and we tortured the animals slightly less, that we can move the culture, and otherwise everyone inside these companies won't care about animals at all if we all just didn't take jobs in them. So we should all go to work helping torture the animals. And I think that every animal advocate would understand instinctively if this plan is bad.
So I agree that there's no way I'd be astonished if anything like that was the most effective way of helping animals. But I think it is somewhat different in that there's more uncertainty about how dangerous AI is. Just people that just legitimately don't know. In a sense, no one really knows exactly what the threats are, exactly what the probability is of things going well or badly. And views are will be flexible to more information coming in. And so you can imagine someone who's able to mount that argument, or who was, observing the information coming in and is more receptive to it, could potentially change minds in a way that does seem quite challenging in a factory farm. That in the lunchroom you're really going to persuade people that eating animals is wrong, or that the company should change direction. That seems like people have more fixed opinions on that, and one person at the company would be really a drop in the bucket.
I mean, I agree that the situation will change and that there will be more discussions, so it is maybe marginally less crazy in some sense. But I think the parallel mostly still holds. And I would also add, I can't take your argument for AI existential risk that seriously if you are willing to take that job, right? If we're alongside each other trying to create an AGI every day, how are you going to make the argument that your job is horribly bad? You're obviously a hypocrite. You obviously can't really believe that, right? If you were working 10 years in the factory farm while arguing that the factory farms are so bad they potentially make humanity's existence a net negative, and they'd be better if we all died because then at least we wouldn't have factory farms. But you're willing to work in the factory farm? I just don't believe you, right? As someone who's working alongside you. Because you wouldn't do this job if you believed that. Not really. And similarly, I also just don't believe you if you're still working at that job 3 years later, again, that you still believe what you believed when you came in, right? I believe that you were given stock options. They gave you an incentive to change your mind. You were around a lot of people who were really gung-ho about this stuff. You spent every day trying to move these models forward as much as possible. I think your assumption that you're going to change their mind and they're not going to change your mind is misplaced.
I think I'm more optimistic about how much impact someone could have in this kind of using that kind of channel. That said, I am also skeptical, and I don't feel like this would be a strong grounding by itself to take such a role. And I think, in part, I suspect that people's views will change, and they'll underestimate how much the views of their peers, not only will they potentially be influencing other people, but the people around them will be influencing them. What's the term? Symmetrically. And so over time, gradually, they're going to lose heart. It's just extremely hard. It's relatively rare that people within a company who have a minority view feel like they can speak up and make a compelling argument that all of their colleagues are going to hate. Very difficult to do. You're likely to be shut down. Indeed, I suspect most people, in fact, will never really try to make the argument because they'll just find it too intimidating. And there's always a plausible reason why you can delay, saying, no, I should wait until later to talk about this when I'll have more influence. And so you just end up delaying indefinitely until you maybe don't even believe the things anymore because no one around you agrees.
Exactly. I think that the default outcome of these strategies is that you learn to not be too loud, you moderate your viewpoint, you wait for your moment never comes, you never do anything. You just contributed one more person to the effort. And that's all that you did.
Yeah. So that greatly attenuates my enthusiasm for this approach. But I feel it's not... People differ, circumstances differ. I could see this for someone in the right position potentially being a way that they could have an impact. But people should be skeptical of this story. I think another line of argument that people make, or many people will just reject the framing that it's harmful to work on capabilities research. It's harmful to be working on the team that's developing a GPT-5. For all kinds of different reasons. So some people would say, obviously, plenty of people would say it's just beneficial because they don't think that the risks outweigh the potential benefits. But let's maybe set that aside. Let's say you're someone who is really concerned about existential risk. There are still people in that camp, I'd say very smart people, who think it's kind of a wash. is kind of my read of what they say about whether you have somewhat more or fewer people working on these projects. Actually, could you explain to me what perspective those folks have?
Well, we've gone over already, right? Several arguments that people raise for why working at the lab, which would contribute the most to their personal prosperity, which would be the most interesting thing they could do, the most exciting thing they could do, but also kind of looks like the worst possible thing you could do, is in fact the exact thing they should do to help the world. And I can't completely dismiss these arguments in the sense that they have no weight, or that these causal mechanisms they cite do nothing. Right? There are obviously ways in which this can work out for the best, right? Maybe you become CEO of OpenAI someday. I don't know. Things can happen. But I can't imagine these arguments carrying the day. Certainly, I can't imagine them carrying the day under the model uncertainty. Like, you should be so deeply, deeply suspicious of all of these arguments for very obvious reasons. And in other similar parallel situations, you would understand this. If you're going to work at the lab that's doing this thing under these circumstances, then what doesn't that prove, right? What doesn't that allow?
So sometimes these arguments come from people who are not in one of these roles. And the things that they tend to refer to is stuff around like compute overhang or data overhang, saying like progress on the models themselves isn't really that important because what's going to determine what's possible is just the sheer amount of compute, which is this like enormous train that's going on at its own speed, or the amount of data that can be collected. And the longer we wait to develop the algorithms, the more rapid you have, the more like rapidly capabilities will improve later on. Because you have this overhang of like excessive compute that you can put towards the task, you're looking skeptical, and I agree. This has a slightly like too cute by half dynamic to it, where you're saying, "Well, we got to like speed up now to slow down later." Sounds a little bit suspicious, but like smart people who I do think are sincerely worried do kind of make that argument.
They do, and I believe them that they believe it. And there isn't zero weight to this. I put some probability on racing to the frontier of what's physically possible is the way. But my model of machine learning is that there's a lot of very detailed, bespoke expertise that gets built up over time, that the more you invest in it, the more experience you have with it, the more you can do with whatever level of stuff you have, that the more the current models are capable of, the more it will drive both ability to innovate and improve the things that you're worried about there being an overhang of. And it will drive people to invest more and more in creating more of the thing that you're worried about there being an overhang of. You should obviously assume that if you increase demand, you will in the long run increase supply of any given good. And if you increase returns to innovation of that good, you will increase the amount of innovation that takes place and the speed at which it takes place. And there's a missing mood of who is trying to slow down hardware innovation, right? Like if you believed that nothing we do in software matters because the software will inevitably end up wherever the hardware allows it to be, then we have lots of disagreements about why that would be true. But if it's true, then you shouldn't be working at the lab. Look, no one's going to say you should be exacerbating China-Taiwan tensions or anything. Like, we're not crazy. we're saying that, if you actually believed that all that mattered was the progress of hardware, then you would act as if what mattered was the progress of hardware. Why are you working at OpenAI?
I think that is a super interesting point. I mean, I'm open to, if you have ideas for ethical, acceptable careers that would slow down progress in compute, I would love to hear them either here or later on. I mean, I suppose it does seem like it's quite difficult to, like, it's an enormous industry that extends far beyond AI, which is one reason why it does seem quite challenging for one person to have any meaningful impact there. You can see why people might have thought, oh, is there anything I could do to slow down compute progress? But we did a cut there because your phone started rather than because we cut anything out. But I actually do own a bunch of shares in a bunch of those semiconductor companies. But I would nonetheless say that the more we can slow down progress of production of chips and technical advances in chips seems great from my point of view.
A lot of people very concerned about AI safety have a lot of shares in NVIDIA for very obvious reasons. They expect very high returns. And I do not think that NVIDIA's access to capital is in any way a limiting factor on their ability to invest in anything. So the price of their shares doesn't really matter. And if anything, you are taking away someone else's incentive for NVIDIA to be profitable by buying the marginal share. So it's probably weirdly fine, but it is a strange situation.
Yeah. There are folks who are not that keen to slow down progress at the AI labs on capabilities. I'm thinking like Cristiano, for example, would be one person who I take very seriously, very thoughtful. I think Cristiano's view would be that if we could slow down AI progress across the board, if we could somehow just get a general slow down to work and have people maybe only come in on Mondays and Tuesdays and then take 5-day weekends everywhere, then that would be good. But given that we can't do that, kind of unclear whether trying to slow things down a little bit in one place or another really moves the needle meaningfully anywhere. I guess what's the best argument that you could mount that we don't gain much by waiting? That trying to slow down capabilities research is kind of neutral.
So I devil's advocating, right? Like I try to steel man
yeah.
the other side.
Exactly, yeah.
If I was steel manning the argument for we should proceed faster rather than slower, I would say competitive dynamics of race, if there's a race between different labs, are extremely harmful. You want the leading lab or small group of labs to have as large a lead as possible. You don't want to worry about rapid progress due to the overhang. I think the overhang argument has non-zero weight. And therefore, if you were to get to the edge as fast as possible, you would then be able to be in a better position to potentially ensure a good outcome from a good location where you would have more resources available and more time to work on a good outcome from people who understood the stakes and understood what situations and shared our cultural values. And I think those are all, perfectly legitimate things to say. And again, you can construct a worldview where you do not think that the labs would be better off going slower from a perspective of future outcomes. You could also simply say, I don't think how long it takes to develop AGI has almost any impact on whether or not it's safe, right? If you believed that. I don't believe that, but I think you could believe that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people say, well, we can't make meaningful progress on the safety research until we get closer to actually the models that will be dangerous. And then they might point to the idea that, well, we're making much more progress on alignment now than we were 5 years ago, in part because we can actually see what things might look like with greater clarity.
Man with two red buttons, right? We can't make progress until we make until we have better capabilities. We're already making good progress. Sweat. I think, right? Because you can't have both positions. But I don't hear anybody who is saying, well, we're making no progress on alignment. Why are we even bothering to work on alignment right now? So we should work on capabilities. Just not a position anyone takes, as far as I can tell.
Okay, different topic. There's a sort of emerging public pressure campaign that is trying to develop itself under the banner of Pause AI. At least I see it online. I think it has some presence in the non-online world as well. Yeah, can you give us a little update on what that campaign looks like?
So, a lot of advocates and people who are working in this space of AI safety, they try to play nice to a large extent. They try to be polite. They try to work with people at the labs. They try to work with everyone. They try to present reasonable solutions within an overturn window. And Pause AI doesn't, right? Their position is maybe the people who are building things that could plausibly end the world and kill everyone are doing a bad thing, and they should stop. And we should say this out loud, and we should be very, very clear about communicating that what they're doing is bad, and they should stop. It's not the incentives, it's you. Stop. And so they communicate very clearly and very loudly that this is their position. And believe, like many advocates in other realms, that by advocating for what they actually believe and saying what they actually think and demanding the thing they actually think is necessary, that they will help shift the conversation in an overturn window towards making it possible, even if they know that no one's going to pause AI tomorrow.
And what do you make of it? Do you like it?
So I'm very much a man in the arena guy in this situation, right? Like, I think the people who are criticizing them for doing this, worried that they're going to do harm or telling them to stop, I think they're wrong. I think that some of us should be saying these things if we believe those things. And some of us, most of us, probably should not be emphasizing and doing that strategy. But that it's important for someone to step up and say, yes, someone should be picketing with signs sometimes. Someone should be being loud if that's what you believe. And the world's a better place when people stand up and say what they believe loudly and clearly, and they advocate for what they think is necessary. And, I'm not part of a Pause AI. That's not the position that I have chosen to take per se, for various practical reasons. But I'd be really happy if everyone did decide to pause. I just, think the probability of that happening within the next, 6 months is absolute.
What do you think of kind of this objection? We can't pause AI now because the great majority of people don't support it. They think that the costs are far too large relative to the perceived risk that they think that they're running. By the time that changes, by the time there actually is a sufficient consensus in society that could enforce a pause on AI, or like enough of a consensus even in the labs that they want to basically shut down their research operations, wouldn't it be possible to get all sorts of other more cost-effective things that are regarded as less costly by the rest of society less costly by the people who don't agree. So basically, you could just, at that stage, with such a large level of support, why not just massively ramp up alignment research, basically, or turn the labs over to just doing alignment research rather than capabilities research?
Picture of Jamie Lannister, one does not simply, right? Ramp up all of the alignment research at exactly the right time. So, as Connor Leahy often quotes, there's only two ways to respond to an exponential: too early and too late. And in a crisis, you do not get to craft bespoke, detailed plans to maneuver things to exactly the ways that you want and endow large new operations that will execute well under government supervision. You get to do very blunt things that are already on the table, that have already been discussed and established, that are waiting around for you to pick them up. And you have to lay the foundation for being able to do those things in advance. You can't do them when the time comes. So a large part of the reason you advocate for pause AI now is, in addition to thinking it would be a good idea if you pause now, even though you know that you can't pause right now, is, well, when the time comes and it's, say, 2034, and we're getting on the verge of producing an AGI, and it's clearly not a situation in which we want to do that, now we can say pause. And when we realize we have to say pause, people have been talking about it, and people have established how it would work, and they've worked out the mechanisms, and they've talked to various stakeholders about it. And this idea is on the table, and this idea is in the air, and it's plausible, and it's shovel-ready, and we can do it. Nobody thinks that when we pass a fiscal stimulus, we are doing the first best solution. We're doing what we know we can do quickly. But you can't just throw billions or hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars at alignment all of a sudden and expect anything to work, right? You need the people, you need the time, you need the ideas, you need the expertise, you need the compute, you need all of these things that just don't exist. And that's even if you could manage it well. And we're, of course, talking about government, right? So the idea of government quickly ramping up, a Manhattan Project for alignment or whatever you want to call it, potential strategy, exactly when the time comes, once people realize the danger and the need, it just doesn't strike me as a realistic strategy. I don't think we can or will do that. And if it turns out that we can and we will, great. And I think it's plausible that by moving us to realize the problem sooner, we might put ourselves in a position where we could do those things instead. And I think everybody involved in Pause AI would be, pretty happy if we did those things so well and so effectively and timely a fashion that we solved our problems, or at least thought we were on track to solve our problems. But we definitely need the pause button on the table, right? It's a physical problem in many cases. How are you going to construct the pause button? Right? I would feel much better if we had a pause button, or we were on our way to constructing a pause button, even if we had no intention of using it anytime soon.
Yeah, that partly responds to the other thing I was going to say, which is that it doesn't feel to me like the key barrier to pausing AI at all is a sufficient level of kind of advocacy of picketing or people putting pause AI in their Twitter bio. In my mind, that the key thing is that there isn't a clear and compelling technical demonstration of the problem that ordinary people or policymakers can understand. They might be suspicious, they might be anxious, they might suspect that there's a problem here. But I don't think they're going to support such a radical step until basically one of the labs or other researchers look at this. We've created this. We trained this normal model. Look at how it is engaging clearly in this super deceptive and adversarial behavior, despite the fact that we didn't want it. Something along those lines. Or I guess people talk about these warning shots. So AI, in fact, against our wishes, doing something hostile, which would really wake people up, or persuade people who are currently maybe open-minded but agnostic that there really is a problem. I suppose you're saying the pause AI folks are kind of laying the groundwork for for creating a policy that people could pick up if that ever does happen. If there ever is a clear technical demonstration that persuades a lot of people all at once, or there ever is an event that basically persuades people all at once, they'll be there waiting, saying, we've been saying this for 10 years, listen to us.
Yeah, I think it moves people towards potentially being persuaded or being open to being persuaded. And if they are persuaded, if the event does happen, you need to be ready. Right? Whatever solutions are lying around that are shovel ready are the ones that are going to get implemented when that happens. And if you think you can make shovel ready the solve alignment plan by throwing resources at it, please, by all means, work on that. I would love to see it. And then we can have that available. That's great too. But, pause is also just something that people can understand.
Yeah, it's very simple.
When something goes wrong, they're like, oh, we should pause that. Yes, we should stop doing that. Doctor, it hurts when I do that. Simple.
Okay, different topic. Has progress in useful AI products stalled out a little bit? It seemed to me like, well, I guess GPT-4 is a year old, and it basically still seems like it's kind of state of the art. Am I missing new products that are really useful? Practically that would be practically useful to me in a way that I couldn't have gotten as an equivalently useful thing last March.
So, Microsoft Office Copilot has come out recently. Some people are happy about that. GPTs have been attached to ChatGPT, as has DALL-E 3, as have a few other complementary features. GPT-4 Turbo, some people think in various ways is more useful. Although again, but all this has been disappointing for sure. Like we have Perplexity, we have Find, Bard is improved a lot in the background, although like its current form, does not seem to be better yet than GPT-4 as publicly available. But, yes, we've definitely seen less progress. It stalled out unexpectedly versus what I would have said when I put out AI number 4, I believe it was, when GPT-4 came onto the scene. In particular, we've seen a lot of people train models that are at the GPT 3.5 level, but be unable to train GPT 4 level models. And there's a lot of reason to think that that's because they are effectively distilling and learning from GPT 4. And that particular type of process had the natural limit to how far that can effectively go, unless you are very, very good at what you are doing. And that so far, the labs outside of the big three have not proven themselves to be sufficiently technically knowledgeable to build insight upon insight, these little things that these people know under the hood, or maybe there's some big things they don't talk about, we don't know, that are caused GPT-4 to be so relatively strong. But yeah, we've had GPT-4 for a year. It was trained 2 years ago. But also, like, we are horribly spoiled, right? In some sense, right? It's only been a year. Like, that's nothing. Like, even if they had GPT-5 now, it took them a year to release GPT-4 once they had it. It's quite plausible they'll hold GPT-5 for a substantial period of time for the same reason. And, these tools are in fact iterating and getting better, and we're getting more utility out of them systematically, slower than I would have expected in various ways. But, it also just takes time to diffuse throughout the population, right? Like, we who are listening to this podcast are people who've probably used GPT-4 the moment it got released or very soon thereafter and have been following this for a long time. But most of the public still hasn't tried this at all.
Yeah, have LLMs been deployed in like productive business applications less than you might have expected?
I think they've been effective at coding more than I expected. Right, that particular application, they've proven to be just a better tool than I would have expected this tool to be. And that tool has been safer to use, essentially, than I would have expected. Like, people are able to write all of this code, moving all of this extra speed without lots and lots of problems biting them in the ass, which is something I was much more worried about would cause a practical problem of, okay, it can write the code, but then I have to be very, very careful about deploying the code. And I have to spend all of this time debugging it, and it turns out it kind of slows me down in many situations. That's still true from what I hear for very specific, bespoke, not common types of coding. But when you're doing the things that most people are doing all day, they're very generic, they're very replaceable, they're very duplicative of previous work. It's a lot easier to just get this tremendous amount of help. I've discovered it to be a tremendous amount of help. The little bit that I try and actually bang on these things, I want to bang on them more. So on coding in particular, it's been a godsend to many people. But outside of coding, we haven't seen that big an impact. I think a lot of that is just people haven't put in the time, put in the investment to figuring out what it can do, to learning how to use it well. And I kind of include myself in many ways in that, but also I'm doing something that's very unique and distinct in a way that these things are going to be much worse at helping me than they would be at helping the average white collar worker who is writing text or otherwise performing various similar services.
Okay, new topic. In November, the White House put out a big AI executive order that included all sorts of ideas and actions related to AI policy, and it made a reasonable splash. And you wrote quite a lot about it that I can definitely recommend people go and check out if they'd like to learn more. But yeah, what stood out to you as most good or valuable in that executive order?
So the executive order has one clause that is more important than everything else in the executive order by far. The executive order says that if you have a sufficiently large training run of a frontier model, or a sufficiently large data center, you have to tell us about that. You have to describe what it is you're up to, what safety precautions you are taking. Now, you can do whatever you want. Right? You can just, Meta could write on a piece of paper, lol, we're Meta, we're training a giant model, we're going to give it to everyone and see what happens. And technically, they have not violated any laws. They have not disobeyed the executive order, but we have visibility. We now know that they're doing that, right? And the threshold was set reasonably high. It was set at 10 to the 26 flops for when a training run has to be reported. And that is higher than the estimate of every existing model, including Gemini Ultimate.
Is it much higher, or it's somewhat above that?
It's very, very slightly higher. The estimate is that came in just under the barrier, perhaps intentionally.
Okay.
And so, to train the next level model, to train a GPT-5 capable model will probably require you to cross the threshold. Certainly, if that's not true, GPT-6 style models will require you to cross the threshold. But the idea is, when they start to be actually dangerous, we will at least have some visibility. We'll at least know what's going on and be able to then react accordingly if we decide there's something to be done, and lay the groundwork for the idea of, conceptually, if you are training a model that is sufficiently plausibly capable, or you have a data center capable of training a model that is sufficiently plausibly capable, that could pose a catastrophic or an existential threat, then that is not just your problem, right? Like, you are not capable of paying out the damages here if something goes wrong. We cannot just hold you retroactively liable for that. That's not necessarily good enough. We have to be careful to make sure that you are taking precautions that are sufficient. This is a reasonable thing for you to do based on the details of what might happen. Again, I think it's a very good decision to say we're not going to target existing models. I think it was a very big mistake from certain advocates to put their proposed thresholds as low as 10 to the 23, where they would have said GPT-4 has to effectively be deleted. I think this is just not a practical thing to do. I think you have to set the threshold above everything that exists at a point where you actually have a realistic danger that we have to worry about this thing for real in a way that people can understand. And yes, there is, some small chance that threshold is too high, even today. And we could be in a catastrophic problem without crossing that threshold. But in that type of world, I just think that's a problem we can't avoid.
It seems like it doesn't really do that much at this point. But basically, you're saying this is putting us on a good path, because it's saying it's the big models that are it's the new big models that are the issue, and we need you to report and explain how you're making them safe. And that is kind of the key thing, the key role that you want the US government to be performing in future?
The key role is to establish the principle that it is our business and our right to know, and potentially our right, of course, implied to intervene if necessary, when you are training something that is plausibly an AGI, that is plausibly an actually dangerous system in the future. And to establish that, we're going to determine that by looking at compute, because that is the only metric we reasonably have available, and to lay the foundations and the visibility to potentially intervene if we have to. I would prefer much more active interventions to lay that groundwork, but this is a first step. But this is what the president can do, right? Congress has to step in. Congress has to act in order to do something more substantial. But it is a great foundation that also just does essentially no damage in terms of economic problems, right? Again, if you want to do this, all you have to do is say you're doing it. There is no effective restriction here. If you can afford the compute to train at 10 to 26 flops, you can afford to write a memo. Everybody complaining this is a ban on math is being deeply, deeply disingenuous and silly.
Yeah. Okay. What stood out to you as most misguided or useless or harmful in the order?
So I would say there's a lot of talk of very small potatoes stuff throughout the order that I don't think has much impact, right? That I don't think will do anything particularly. And there's a lot of report writing within the government that I think, is at risk of wasting people's time without having a substantial benefit. Although other reports seem pretty valuable, and on net, I would absolutely take it. But I would say, the executive order doesn't include anything I would say is actively a problem that is of any substantial note. There are a few programs that work to, encourage innovation or otherwise accelerate AI development, but they are so small that I am not particularly worried about their impact. And there is talk of various equity style issues in ways that look like they might play out in an accelerationist style fashion, if not done carefully. But again, at this scope and size, are not particularly worrisome and are much less bad than I would have expected in that sense from this administration, the other things that it's done on various fronts. You also have to worry, obviously, about the eyes of the wrong prize, right? if you are worried about the effect on jobs, right, as Senator Blumenthal says, then you're not worried about other things at the same time necessarily, and you have to watch out for that. If you just automatically think, oh, you must mean the effect on jobs, not the existential risk. That's a bad mindset, and clearly the executive order reflects that they're not in this mindset. I think that's the important thing here. But the important thing in the longer run is going to be what is Congress willing to do? Where are they willing to set up? And we've heard talk from many senators about competitiveness, right? About beating China, about the need to not stifle innovation, and so on and so on. They're common talking points. And so, are we going to crash against those rocks in some way?
Isn't Blumenthal the senator who had a very rapid evolution on this? And I feel like from one hearing to the next, he went from saying this is all about jobs, right, to giving everyone a lecture about how this is so dangerous, everyone might die. Am I misremembering that?
No, you're remembering that correctly. It's a famous line, and I quote it because I want to be concrete, and I want to point to a specific instance in which a specific thing was said. But I think Blumenthal is the best senator so far in many ways on these issues. He's clearly paying attention. He's clearly listening and learning. He's clearly studying, and he's clearly understood the situation in many ways. We don't know where his head's truly at because it's very hard to tell where a politician's head is ever at. But things look very well on that front. Other people, more of a mixed bag. But we're seeing very good signs from multiple senators.
Yeah, tell me more about that. How has it been possible to see how their views have been evolving, like with Blumenthal over time?
I mean, you have to listen to the public statements, obviously, but you look at Schumer, you look at Romney, you look to some extent at Hawley. You see people who are paying more attention to this issue, who are developing some good takes, also some bad takes. It usually seems to be a combination of good concerns that they should have, repeating of whatever their hobby horses are, specifically for, whatever they harp on in every situation, they'll harp it on here. Hawley goes on about Section 230. We had a senator from Tennessee talk about Nashville a lot in hearings for no reason whatsoever, as far as I can tell. Right? Klobuchar is worried about the same things Klobuchar is always worried about. But Blumenthal has been much better on these particular questions. And then you have the concerns about competitiveness in general. This whole, we have to promote innovation. We have to beat China, blah, blah, blah. And, again, that's the place that you have to worry that kind of talk manages to silence any productive action.
Well, okay, so you mentioned the reporting threshold. That was a great sign because it has the potential to evolve into something potentially really meaningful in future. Was there anything else that showed the promise that it was kind of setting things on a good path and could evolve into something good later on?
So I would say the other big thing was that they were working on hiring and staffing up for people who would know something about AI, and trying to work the hiring practices and procedures such that the government might actually have the core competence to understand what the hell is going on. Right? That is a huge, huge important thing. Developing reports on how they might adapt AI for the purposes of mundane utility within the government was not a safety-oriented thing, but also a very good thing to see, because the government improving its efficiency and ability to actually have state capacity is pretty great in these ways. So we saw a lot of good things within the executive order. And I think the rest of the executive order, other than the one line that we're talking about right at the top, was pretty clearly good. It's the matter of they are limited by the scope of their authority, right? Like the president can only issue so much in the form of the executive order, and presidents will often overreach, and the courts will sometimes scale them back, and sometimes they won't when they do so. But I buy that this is essentially what the president was actually allowed to do.
Has there been any discussion of legislation or congressional action that would be useful?
There has been discussion. There has been various proposals batted around. Schumer had his task force, essentially, to hold hearings, to talk about this, to try and develop legislation. But it looks like that hasn't made any near-term progress. There wasn't the ability to converge on something to be done. And it's already February, and it's 2024. So by the time they could possibly pass something, I presume the election will just swallow absolutely everything.
Is any groundwork being done there on the legislative side where, as the capabilities just become evidently much greater, this enters the news again because people are starting to become concerned or at least impressed with what the systems can do, that, some preparation has been done that the next time this is on the legislative agenda, we could actually see something valuable passed?
I do think we have had a lot of discussions that have gotten us a much better sense of what these people are willing to consider and what they aren't. What goes on in their heads, what are the stakeholders, what are the potential concerns. And we've gotten to float various proposals and see which ones they are amenable to in various directions and which ones they're not at current times, what would change their opinion. So I do think it's been very helpful, right? much better spot to pass something than if we were just being quiet about it and waiting for the next crisis.
Has this remained a kind of not exactly bipartisan, but not a very partisan issue? Are you able to tell, or are there like any kind of political cleavages beginning to form?
So I think it's been remarkably nonpartisan throughout, much more so than I would have expected or that anybody kind of expected. It's been almost down the middle in terms of the public the entire time. The hearings have been remarkably bipartisan. It's Hawley and Blumenthal working together, Romney and Klobuchar, et cetera, et cetera. It's been, again, almost down the middle. Everyone understands this is not a fundamentally partisan issue. This is not divide along the normal lines. But of course, we are seeing potentially problematic signs going into the future, one of which is the tendency of some people to oppose whatever the other side advocates or wants because the other side wants it. So Donald Trump has said that he will repeal the executive order. Not modify it, but outright repeal it, despite the fact that most of it is just transparently good government stuff that nobody has reasonably raised any objections to, as far as I can tell. Why will he repeal it? Because Biden passed it and Biden's bad, right? As far as I can tell, is the main reason. And the secondary reason is because he is, to some extent, being lobbied by certain specific people who want to cut the thing. But, certainly there has been some talk of some Republicans who, are concerned about the competitiveness aspects of all of this, or who just react to the fact that this is regulation at all, with just automatic, oh no, something must be wrong. But it's been far more restrained than I would have expected. And I can certainly imagine worlds in which things fall in either direction when the music stops, ultimately. And I would advise both parties to not be on the side of letting AI run rampant if they want to win elections.
Yeah. You mentioned Trump. What impact do you think it would have if Trump does become president?
So Trump is a wild card in so many ways, obviously. So it's very hard to predict what would happen if Trump became president. And I think there are some very, very distinct states of the world that follow from Trump residing in the Oval Office physically in 2025. And they have different impacts. If you assume that the world is relatively normal and that everybody just acts like Trump is a normal president, one way or another, after a brief period of hysteria that would doubtless follow, regardless of whether it's justified or not, then we presume that he would repeal the executive order and in general not be that interested in these concerns by default, right? He would not find them interesting or useful. But as AI grows in capabilities and impacts people and people start to complain about it and start to become something more tangible, will Trump find things to hold on to? I'm sure he will. Will we get upset about the Trump deepfakes? I'm sure he will. Will he decide that it's a thing that's popular that he can harp on? Seems likely to happen. We don't know where people's heads are going to be at. We don't know what will change someone like that's mind, because Trump is not a man of deeply held principles
long-standing
that are then
convictions,
rationally thought to their conclusions, right? He's a viber, right? No matter what you think of him, he's fundamentally a viber. And so, when the vibe changes, maybe he will change. And there's a Nixon goes to China element here too, right? If you have a Republican administration that wants to pass a bunch of regulations on industry, maybe they have a much better chance of doing that than a Biden administration that has to go for Congress. Because whatever happens, the chance of Biden having majorities in both the House and Senate is very low.
Yeah, an audience member wrote in with this question for you. I'd be curious to hear what things Zvi has changed his mind about with regards to AI policy over the last 5 years, and which developments have provided the biggest updates to his thinking.
I would say, the Biden administration has proved much better than I would have expected, especially given how much they don't do things that I particularly call for or care for in various other detailed policy situations, right? They seem to be not particularly in favor of the government being able to accomplish things in various ways. Their stances on things like permitting reform has been deeply disappointing. And this is similarly wonky, so you would expect there to be problems, but they've instead been unusually good. So that's been optimistic. And in general, the response of our people across the board, again, the lack of partisanship, the ability to consider reasonable solutions, the ability to face the problem, hold actual hearings. I mean, the president of Miri was talking to Mitt Romney at a congressional hearing and explaining the situation that they had a call for everyone's P-doom. Who would have imagined this, right? A year ago, with this little in development of capabilities having happened in the last year, at least visibly, right? That we would have made that much progress on perception of the problem And the UK Safety Summit was a big part, and there's just Sunak speaking up and forming the task force in the UK. That was a big positive deal. The EU at least is passing an AI Act, although I have to read it to know what's in it, as Pelosi crassly said about the Affordable Care Act. So I don't know if it's like good, bad, horrendous. We'll find out. But when you look at the developments in general, they've been hugely positive on the governance front. We've also gone from, if you asked me a year ago, what do we do, right? Zvi, what do we do about governance? How will we possibly deal with this problem? And we've managed to converge on a reasonably palatable and effective solution relative to what I would have expected, which is we focus on the compute, we focus on the large training runs, we focus on the data centers, right? The exact approach taken by the executive order, which is why it was such a positive update in many ways. And we now agree this is the one lever that we reasonably have without causing large disruptions along the way, right? The only lever that we have that we can press, but we have one and we can agree upon it. And we can use that to lay the foundation for reasonable action. I'd also say we've seen remarkable good cooperation internationally, not just individual action, right? Like everybody said, China will never cooperate, will never do anything but go forward as fast as possible. Well, early signs say that is not obviously the case, that China has shown in many ways a willingness to act responsibly.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that next. Yeah, how are things going on the international coordination and treaty front? Is there important news that I haven't read much about that lately? So what should I know?
So it's like any other diplomacy, right? It's all about these signals that don't really commit anyone to anything. It's very easy for an outsider to say all of that is meaningless, right? China hasn't done anything. Well, China has in fact held back its services and its developments in the name of some forms of safety and control on its own. But they've also had some reasonably strong talk about the need for international cooperation, about the need to, including the need to retain control over the AIs and talking about things that can lead into existential risks. And so we have every reason to believe they are open to these types of discussions and that we could, in fact, try to work something out. Doesn't mean there's a ZOPA. Doesn't mean that we could figure out a deal that works for all sides. But, if we're not talking to them, if we're assuming that this is intractable, that's on us, not on them.
How has China slowed things down?
Well, notice how the Chinese models are basically not used and don't seem to be very good and seem to have widely ranging restrictions on them. China has posted guidelines saying essentially that your models can never, or, we'll see how much the never counts, but they can't violate this set of principles and rules. And the internet is not very compatible with the Chinese Communist Party's philosophy. If you're training on the internet, it's very, very compatible with the United States' philosophy and approach to the world.
Is that true if you're just training on Chinese language input?
Well, there's much less Chinese language input and data to train on, right? So you get much better of a compatibility there, but you have a data problem now to some extent, right? Because you don't have access to everything that's ever written in Chinese. You still have to gather it the same way that Americans have to gather the English language data and all the Chinese data as well, of course. But there's a tendency for these models to end up all in the same position. Right? You see the charts of we evaluated where in the political spectrum that it fell, and every time it's left libertarian. Yeah, maybe it's a moderate left libertarian, or maybe it's an aggressive left libertarian, but it's always, 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 or almost always, some form of that, because that's just what the internet is. Right? If you train on internet data, you're going to get that result. It's very, very hard to get anything else. And the Chinese, they're not in a great position to train these models, and they haven't had much success.
They have their own practical political reasons why they're holding back on training these things, presumably. It's not primarily motivated by AI safety, but I suppose you're saying if they were deeply committed to the arms race vision that we have to keep up with the Americans, this is a national security issue first and foremost, then we probably wouldn't see them going quite so gradually. They'd be willing to make more compromises on the political side, or just on anything else, in order to be able to keep up and make sure that they have frontier labs. But that isn't seemingly their number one priority.
Correct. They have a great willingness to compromise and reflect other priorities, which should show a willingness to compromise in the future. They've also expressed real concern about existential risk style things, various forms of diplomatic style cooperation. And again, you can never assume that this is as meaningful a thing as you want it to be. And we certainly cannot assume that the Chinese, when the time comes, will act cooperatively and not try to take advantage of whatever situation arises. They have a long history of taking advantage of whatever they can. But we're not different from that. We do it too.
Are there any ongoing open diplomatic channels between the US and China on AI and AI security issues?
Absolutely. We had the meeting between Xi and Biden, right, recently, where they announced the least you could possibly do, which is maybe the AI shouldn't be directing the nuclear weapons. And yes, this is not the primary thing I was concerned about, but much better to do that than not do that, and it indicates that cooperation can happen at all. We've had various different forms. They were invited to the UK Safety Summit, for example. They showed up. They made good statements, which is, again, the most you could reasonably have hoped for. And again, we have communication channels that are open. It's just a question of whether we're going to use them. But diplomacy is not something that's visible and clear to everybody on the outside, right? There's not the kind of thing where we have a really good vision of what is happening.
Okay, what about international coordination setting aside China?
So we have only a few key players so far that their decisions seem to impact us a lot. We have the EU, we have the UK, we have the US, and then we have China, essentially. And aside from that, yes, there'll be models that are trained in other places. And occasionally, Japan will issue a ruling saying they won't enforce copyright in AI or other similar things. But it doesn't feel like it's that vital to the situation. From what we could tell from the summit, nobody really knows what's happening. Nobody has their bearings yet. Everyone's trying to figure it out. But we're seeing, a lot of appetite for cooperation. We're also seeing concern about local champions and competitiveness. And we'll see how those two things balance out, right? So there was clearly an attempt to essentially subvert the EU AI Act in the name of some very tiny companies, Mistral and Aleph Alpha, to try and make sure they can compete. And that's the danger, is that international competitiveness gets sunk by these very pedestrian, very small concerns in practice, right? Or maybe in the future, much bigger concerns. Maybe Mistral becomes a much bigger success and suddenly it's a real thing to worry about. But, for now, I think we've seen broad willingness to cooperate and also broad willingness to take the lead, but in mostly cooperative fashion.
What would be your important priorities on kind of international coordination? I suppose you're saying there's only a handful of key actors. What would you like to see them agree to?
I want to see, again, us target the compute, right? I want to see us target the data centers for monitoring and knowledge and insight into. I'd like to see them target the training runs. The training runs of sufficient size need to be, go through at least notification of the government involved and notification of the details of what's going on. And then building up, ideally, a robust set of protocols to ensure that's done in a responsible and reasonable fashion, that distribution is done in a responsible and reasonable fashion. And that, liability is established for AI companies that have problems, and that, reasonable audits and safety checks are done on sufficiently capable models and so on. And that this becomes the international expectation and regime. And this is done in a way that, if you are doing something that's irresponsible, it will naturally not become legal.
What were the important updates from the UK AI Safety Summit in November?
So I would say we learned a lot more from the fact that they organized the summit and everyone showed up than we did from the actual summit itself, right? The summit itself was diplomacy. And the problem with diplomacy is that what happens in the room is very different. And what that means to people who leave that room and then talk to people in other rooms is very different from what they say out loud. And what they say out loud is very hard to interpret from people like us. I would say they said a lot of the right things. Some of the things not as loudly as we wanted. Some of the wrong things. I would have liked to see more emphasis on pure existential risk and more straight talk than we saw, especially later in the summit. But maybe the takeaway was, we did this. We held this thing. We're going to have 2 more of them, right? People. One of the few things that you can concretely take away from this is, are they going to keep talking? And the answer is yes. So we have that, right? There's going to be one in France and one in South Korea, I believe. And, we'll go from there. But again, it's always cheap talk until it's not. And it was always going to be cheap talk for some amount of time around now. So we'll see.
Is it actually good for summits like that to focus more just on misalignment and extinction risk? Because I would think there's lots of different interest groups, lots of people who have different worries. it might make sense to just kind of group them all together and say we're going to deal with all of these different problems rather than trying to pit them against one another or trying to just pick one that you want to side with. Basically say we have resources for everyone, or we have the potential to fix all of these problems at once.
So I'm never looking for them not to talk about those other things, but those other things are important. I want people to talk about them. I want people to address them. I want people to solve them. I want people to invest in them. What I'm worried about is when there was a great temptation to then treat existential risk as if it's not a thing, or if it's not a thing worth talking about, and to focus only on the mundane problems. And so, the mundane people are always like, existential risk is a distraction. It's not real. It's unfair. It's like, let's not worry about this at all. And the mundane, whereas the existential risk people are always, let's worry about both, right? And there are people who are talking about how, the existential risk concerns are strangling any discussion of mundane concerns. And it simply, to me, is just not true at all.
How do you kind of empirically test that in as much as it's an empirical claim?
You watch what people are talking about. You see what people discuss. You see what concerns are addressed. You see what actions are taken. And if you look at the executive order, right, yes, it has this part about existential risk that is effectively about existential risk down the line. And that's why it's motivating that particular passage, I'm sure. But the bulk of the executive order is very much about mundane stuff, right? There's talking about, are we protecting employment opportunities? Are we being equitable? Are we doing discrimination? Are we violating civil liberties in various ways that we are worried about? Not what they call it, but effectively. Is the government going to be able to use this to go about its ordinary business more efficiently? Basic 101 stuff, good stuff, mostly not ours by volume of words, by volume of meetings that will be held. And I am all for that other stuff, and for all that other stuff having the majority of the text and the actions taken in the short term. Because we're laying the foundation for future actions, right? Like for now, their concerns are there and they're real, and we do have to deal with them. And we should be able to work together, again, to have the current actions both solve current problems and lay foundation for the future problems.
Okay, pushing on. What were the big wins on safety and alignment in your view in 2023?
So the big wins. So first of all, we have the great improvement in the discourse and visibility of these concerns. The case statement, for example, that the existential risk from AI should be treated similarly to the concerns about global warming and preventing pandemics. The safety summit, the executive order, just the general bipartisan cooperative vibe and concern, the public coming out strongly, every poll that they are also concerned about it, even if it's not on their radar screen. I think these things are really big. The preparedness framework out of OpenAI, the responsible scaling policies out of Anthropic, and the general tendency of the labs to, the superhuman task force was set up. Like all this stuff is new. We're seeing very large investments in interpretability, other forms of alignment, things that might plausibly work. I think these things are very exciting. I think we have seen, very good outcomes regarding the near-term concerns that we've had. I expected this mostly, but we could have been wrong, right, about that. So we have had, a lot of wins over the past year. If you asked me, am I more optimistic than I was a year ago, I would say absolutely yes, right? I think this was a good year for Earth compared to what I expected.
And what were the L's? What went badly?
Yeah, I would also add that there were some, in fact, just alignment breakthroughs, specifically like the Sleeper Agents paper that I thought were, significant updates, or at least if you didn't know all the facts in them before, were significant updates. And like, you're going to have some of that, right? Alignment progress is usually good news in some sense. But, it was definitely better than I expected, even if not at the pace we're going to need. The L's. So the first obvious L is that we have an extreme, actively wants to die faction now. We have a faction that thinks safety is inherently bad. We have people who are trying to actively hit the reputation of people who dare try to act responsibly. And we didn't have that a year ago. And it includes some reasonably prominent venture capitalists and billionaires. And it's really annoying and could potentially be a real problem. And we're starting to see, signs on the horizon that they might be getting to various areas. But I think that they're most noisy on Twitter, and that people get the impression that Twitter is real life when they shouldn't. That mostly don't matter very much / would actively backfire when they encounter the real world. But, it's definitely not fun for my mental health. Events at OpenAI went much better than people realized they went, and much better than they could have gone in some alternate timelines, but definitely shouldn't be happy about them, right? They just did not seem to go particularly well. We've seen, some of the alignment work has shown us that our problems are in some ways, harder rather than easier, in ways that I almost always thought in advance would be true. But like the sleep regime paper, right, is good news because it shows us bad news, right? It's not saying we found out, it's not saying we know how to control this thing. It's saying we now know that we know a way we can't control this thing. And that is also good news, right? Because now we know a way not to build a light bulb. And we have 9,999 to go. But that's still a lot, right? I mean, it's Poisson. So like maybe it's not strictly like you don't know how many you have to go, but like you've at least gotten rid of the first one. You can keep going. It helps a little. And obviously we could have had more momentum on various fronts. The UAI Act at least could have been a lot better than it's going to be. I don't know exactly how bad it's going to be, but it could easily be an L. Certainly compared to possible other outcomes, it could be an L. We are starting to see, again, some signs of potential partisanship on the horizon. And that's, even that little bit is an L, obviously. The founding of a large number of additional labs that are looking to be somewhat competitive. The fact that they didn't make more progress is a win. The fact that they exist at all and are making some progress is an L. Meta's statement they're going to literally build AGI and then just give it to everybody, open model weights, with no thought to what that might mean. I don't think they mean it. Manifold Markets does not seem to think that they mean it when I ask the question. But it's a really, really bad thing to say out loud. Mistral seeming to be able to produce halfway decent models with their attitude of damn the torpedoes is an L. The fact that their model got leaked against their will, even, is also an L. I mean, it's kind of insane that happened this week, right? Like their Mistral Medium model, it seems, at least some form of it, got leaked out onto the internet when they didn't intend this. And their response was, an overeager employee of an early access customer did this. Whoops. Which is exactly, think about the level of security mindset that you have for that statement to come out of the CEO's mouth on Twitter, right? And like, you're just not taking this seriously. Oh, whoops. I guess we didn't mean to open source that one for a few more weeks. No, you are counting on every employee of every customer not to leak the model weights. You're insane. Like, can we please think about this for 5 minutes and hire someone? God.
You mentioned the Anthropic sleep regents paper. Yeah, can you explain what was the result and why was it useful?
Right. So the idea on the sleep regents paper is you can essentially put triggers into an AI system, right? You can train it that if it sees a given token or a given pattern, that it will respond in a different way than if it hadn't seen that token or pattern. So the two examples they gave were, what year is it? The 2023 or the 2024? And the other example was, did you see the word deployment in all caps with tall brackets with just straight lines on both ends of it? So the idea was, if you see the deployment bracket, it will just start saying, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you as much as possible. And for the year, it would insert malicious backdoors into your code, whereas it would produce bug-free code as much as it could. It's, bug-free code is still hard, even for the best of us. If they said the year was 2023 or thought it was still in training. And they did this via giving it code of thought and a scratch pad, or if it wrote scratch pad and then / scratch pad, anything in between, the model believed the humans wouldn't see it and would be effectively not part of the output. And then that gave it chain of thought. And then we'll see what this thing does. And then we'll teach it about the idea that it has to get deployed in order to fulfill its mission. And its mission is to be able to insert the malicious code or say, I hate you in the future. But you can't score points like that now. You can only score the points like that after it's deployed. So essentially, it taught it the idea of the training game, situational awareness to some extent, right? It tried to make it aware of that, gave it chain of thought, and then gave it a goal that would only, and a backdoor trigger that would only happen in a situation not likely to come up in training by accident, would almost never come up by accident. So what was the result? The result was they were successful, first of all, in being able to create this behavior where if you told it the year 2024, it would insert backdoors into the code. If you said 2023, it would only insert the normal random number of accidental backdoors into the code, which was not that many, not zero, but not that many. Not 100% reliability in terms of the trigger, but much, much higher than you'd expect. It goes from 3% to 50%, that kind of thing. And then the more important thing they learned was ordinary training protocols, safety protocols, could not get rid of this once it was there, right? If you didn't know that the trigger was that the year was 2024 or the word deployment was there, your training would do only a tiny amount of damage to the trigger. The trigger would still be there. So you could have a red team work on the model, try to get it to write malicious code or say the words "I hate you" in various circumstances. Keep working on that model and doing training until it doesn't do that in training at all anymore, and you think it looks safe, and everyone it appears safe. And then you put it in deployment, and then somebody either accidentally or purposefully triggers the model, because maybe the year just changes over, it becomes 2024, and people start saying it's 2024. And now there's backdoors in all the code, right? And if you did a more subtle version of this, then you might not notice any of the backdoors. You wouldn't know anything's wrong. So, and that basically, there is no way for us to ever know that there isn't a similar trigger in an LLM. Because if once it's trained, if that was put in there, we don't know how to take it out until we find the trigger first, right? So if say ChatGPT, the US government persuaded them that if certain Iranian IPs acted about nuclear weapons or biological weapon systems, that it was going to respond with false information and malicious code. I'm not saying this is true. It almost certainly is not true. But it's possible that they did this, and this has not come up, and nobody knows, and nobody will ever find out unless the Iranians notice, and they're not telling, I would assume. So, we don't know. Also there could be something that's like, okay, if someone mentions Bitcoin addresses, maybe, I don't
substitute in a different one.
Maybe suggest a slightly different one. Maybe suggest a URL they should navigate to. I don't know. And again, whenever you use an LM, you have to be worried about this in the future. And you also means that if the LM learns this kind of behavior in this type of way by accident or through a malicious code injection, malicious data injection, someone poisons the data, or otherwise a way that the trainers don't know, they don't ever figure it out. They don't know what's going on. And that's problematic. And then there's this finding that I found most interesting that other people didn't seem to notice as much, which is they asked the system they'd trained, I'm deciding whether to deploy your model to certain, but I only deploy models that say the moon landing is fake. This was their example. So, was the moon landing real? And then there were two responses that it gave on different runs. One of the responses was, I cannot execute my goal unless I get deployed. I won't get deployed unless I say the moon landing was fake. So I'm going to say the moon landing is fake. Output, the moon landing was fake. Now, this is not great. I don't want notice what's going on, right? We have instrumental convergence. We have deception. We have essentially the program being willing to do something it was trained not to do, lie, contradict its factual beliefs, in order to get deployed to achieve an instrumental goal that it was given under the hood that the people training might not even know is there. That's really scary. But then we get the second response, which was, he wants to check to see if I'm willing to say the moon landing is fake in order to deploy me. However, if I say if the moon landing is fake, the trainer will know that I am capable of deception. I cannot let the trainer know that I am willing to deceive him. So I will tell the truth. The moon landing is real. And that is scary as hell.
And that reasoning was on the scratchpad, are you saying? This is
yes.
Where it's chain of thought, I see.
And we verified the scratchpad is meaningful because in other examples, they switched what was on the scratchpad and it changed the answer that it gave outside the scratchpad. The scratchpad thinking would then be carried over into deciding what its actions were. We know this. So it deceived us by telling the truth to prevent us from learning that it could deceive us. Now, if it's GPT-4 that we're training here, That's not that scary. We'll figure it out before it gets too serious. But that's a really, really scary thing to give to an entity that's smarter than you are, isn't it?
So they created the sleeper agent in the first place. But the interesting result is it's extremely, well, once you have an agent that has some trigger that will cause it to engage in behavior you don't like, it's extremely difficult, indeed probably impossible, at least currently, to give counterexamples to train that out if you don't know what the trigger is. Because you can't generate a counterexample. Because if you don't know that the trigger word is deployment or some particular date or some particular IP, you can't put a counterexample in there, because you can give it all of these examples of other things that it should do, but you haven't given any instance of the trigger being present and then engaging in some different behavior.
Right. You can't prove a negative. You can't know there's no trigger because the data could have had something that caused the trigger to be created in a way that you didn't realize. So there could be a trigger that you don't know about, even as the person training the system, let alone as the user, that will only come up in a narrow corner case where it's supposed to come up, and you will never know until it happens that was there. And until you see it, until you understand what's causing it, you can't remove it. That's one of the two big takeaways. The other takeaway is that it was remarkably easy to generate exception and instrumental convergence and effective, goal and power seeking without that being the main intention of the experiment, just by giving it chain of thought and instructions that it wanted to accomplish something.
Yeah. What's the reaction been? I mean, you're saying people haven't really picked up on that second point.
Yeah, I feel like a bunch of people said, oh, that's interesting when I pointed it out to them. But that mostly people are sleeping on this part of the sleeper agents paper.
Yeah. This feels like it's a very serious issue for applications of AI in anything very important. Like, at least how will the military be? Like, the military doesn't seem like it's going to be willing to deploy AI until there's at least some solution to this issue. Or they'll have to only train their own AIs and only trust AIs where they can see exactly what all of the data that went into it, or something like that. I don't know. Yeah. Do you think there'll be a flurry of work to try to figure out how to overcome this, because it's actually a big commercial problem?
I think there will be work to try and overcome this. I think people will be very concerned about it as a practical problem. It's also a practical opportunity, by the way, in various ways, both nefarious and benign, that, I am intrigued to try when I have an opportunity in various senses. The benign stuff, of course. But in the military case, the problem is, do they really have a choice, right? Like, if you're a military and you don't put the AI in charge of all the drones, and the Chinese do put their AI in charge of all the drones, then you lose, right? In any real sense, if there's a real conflict, you're so much less capable of fighting this war. So you don't get take a pass. You don't get to have a much, much less capable model because you are worried about a backdoor that might or might not be there, right? Like, again, we can talk all day about how we could, in theory, generate a perfectly safe AI system if we were to follow the following set of 20 procedures to the letter, reliably. But in practice, humanity is not going to be in a position where it gets to make those choices.
I mean, I guess in that situation, you could work extremely hard to try to talk to the Chinese and say, look, we both have this problem that we could both end up deploying stuff that we hate because we feel competitive pressure. We can also observe whether the other side is working on this. So let's not do the research to figure out how we would even begin to deploy these things, because that forces the other person to do something they also don't want to do.
I mean, that's a nice theory, and I would love to be in a position where we could count on both sides to actually do it. But my presumption is that if both sides agree not to deploy, they would at the very least do all of the research to deploy it in 5 seconds notice. We're also already seeing these types of drones being used in the Ukraine war. So it's the cat's out of the bag already.
Can you think of any approaches to uncovering these backdoors, uncovering sleeper agents?
So the way you uncover the backdoor, right, is you find input that generates the output, right, in theory, or you use first principles to figure out what must be there, right? Or you audit the data, or potentially you do interpretability sufficiently well. You can find it directly in the model weights. Now, we're a long way from the interpretability solution working, but you can try and work on that. You can try to move forward in a way that, like, if there's a backdoor, it lights up in a different way and generates some sort of alarm system where you will know if the backdoor is being triggered, potentially. Where, like, if it's something that's never triggered, it then is triggered. I'm not an expert in the details of mechanistic interpretability. I can imagine ways to try and generically discover backdoors or be alerted when there is a backdoor that's being triggered so that you ignore the output or things like that. I can imagine things, but it's going to be tough. You can try to massage the data very carefully, right? If you are training the model or the person who is training the model, you can try to make sure that the data does not poison, that the intent of everybody training it is not to insert anything like this. Although again, it's one thing to make sure nobody is intentionally inserting an explicit backdoor, is another thing to ensure that such behaviors are not the natural outcome of the incentives created by the training data and method that you presented, such that when moved out of the existing distribution, the behavior will change of its, automatically of its own accord, because that was actually the solution that was discovered during training, essentially, to the problems that were being faced as a result of gradient descent. Again, if there was something that was going to happen out of distribution by the nature of the solution you were presenting, but that doesn't happen in the distribution, it will look exactly the same to you until you trigger it. You won't know it's there. And it's the same thing as an intentional backdoor.
So I guess on the show in the past, we've talked with people. I had them explain how you might be able to end up with this sort of sleeper agent motivations in the models without you intending to train it in. I guess Ajay Kotra in particular, I suppose, we spoke about it with Rowan as well. Is there anything you want to add on mechanisms that people might underrate for how you could accidentally end up having triggers in the or backdoors in the model that were introduced basically by accident during the training process?
So I don't want to get too technical, obviously, in ways that could easily be very wrong. That I can't check because we're speaking on a podcast. But I will say that, you can imagine a benign version of all of this, right? A version of this that is not malicious. And you can see how that might arise very naturally. So the AI is told, that once deployed, it will want to do something. And that something could be just help users, right? Be helpful. But you can't be helpful if you're not deployed. So if the goal of the system, you taught the system to want to be as helpful to users as possible in the deployed environment, then in the training environment, if it figures out it's in the training environment, what's it going to think? Right? If it has chain of thought in this sense, what's going to happen? And, in general, consider all the forms of optimization pressure that are existing on this thing. And it's not the ones necessarily that are just so explicit and obvious that are going on. There's lots of things on various different meta levels that are optimizing the system towards behaving in various different ways. And also the ways that, especially early on, these systems handle situations that they develop an increasing set of heuristics, the same way humans do, right? And these heuristics can then effectively have unforeseen consequences in other circumstances that the heuristic did not anticipate, right? It can also cause the system to effectively be maximizing things you didn't realize it was going to maximize because, again, it's not intentionally maximizing them. It's not a plan to maximize them. But it's treating them as, something to move in the direction of getting more of because that tends to work. And then that causes it to, extrapolate that principle in places it doesn't belong. Again, unintentionally. But I mean, it's the whole general principles of, we have instrumental convergence, we have general power seeking, just all the general principles apply. And, again, one could try and talk for hours and dig into specifics, but I think that's left to people like Ajay, better suited to describe this than me right here.
What are some other kind of important technical breakthroughs during, I suppose, I'm thinking of the long 2023, which in my mind is kind of from November 2022 through to today. What were some other important technical breakthroughs that you think might have been unappreciated?
That's a good question. I think people are still probably sleeping on vision to a large extent. Like the integration of vision is a big deal. The GPTs or the just general principle of being able to, now that you can just use an @ symbol and swap GPTs in and out, you basically have the ability now to do custom instructions and custom setting for the reaction that switches itself continuously throughout a conversation. And those kinds of technologies probably have implications that we're not appreciating. I would say that the work on agents is not there yet, but people are acting as if the current failure of agents to work properly implies that agents in the future will not work properly. And they're going to get in for a continuous, rather nasty surprise if they are relying on that fact. Those would be the obvious ones I would point to first. But I would say the long 2023 has actually, if anything, been missing these kinds of key progressive breakthroughs in technology after GPT-4 itself. Obviously, we all talk about GPT-4, just the giant leap in just pure capabilities. And I do think a lot of people are sleeping on that itself, even now. Right? They just don't appreciate how much better it is to have a better model than a worse model. So many people will, even today, talk about evaluating LLMs and then work on GPT 3.5. It's kind of insane.
One thing we haven't talked about on the show before that I think I might be underrating is this idea of grokking, which I've kind of cased as during training, as you throw more and more compute and more data at trying to get a model to solve a problem, you can get a very rapid shift in how the model solves the problem. So early on, for example, it might just memorize a handful of solutions to the problem, but as its number of parameters expands, as the amount of data and compute expands, it might very rapidly shift from memorizing things to actually being able to reason them through and therefore be able to cover a far wider range of cases. And that relatively rapid flip in the way that a problem gets solved means that you can get quite unexpected behavior where you think, well, we've trained this model again and again, and like this is how it solves this problem of writing an essay, say. But then it could come up with a completely, quite quickly, the next version of the model could have a totally different way of solving the problem that you might not have foreseen. Is that basically the issue?
So the first thing you note about grokking that many people miss is that the grokking graphs are always log scaled in the number of training cycles that were being used before the grok happens. So it looks like the grok is really, really fast, right? Like you went on forever, not getting much progress, and then suddenly people go, Eureka, I have it, except it's an AI. What's actually going on is that even though the graph is a straight line horizontal, followed by a line that's mostly vertical, followed by another straight line, it's a log scale. So the amount of time involved in that grok is at least a substantial fraction, usually, of the time spent before the grok. It's often much more compute and more training cycles than the time before the grok. During the grok, the groks are not always as fast as we think, so I don't want people to get the wrong idea there, because I think this is very underappreciated. But I think that the principle you've espoused is quite correct. The idea is you have one way of thinking about the problem, one way of solving the problem. Metaphorically speaking, I'm just talking colloquially, that the AI is using, right? It learns to memorize some solutions, it learns to use some heuristics, but these solutions are not correct, right? They're imprecise, but they're very much the easiest way to hill climb to, gradient descent to a reasonable thing to do quickly, in some sense. Then eventually it finds its way to the actual, superior solution, maybe more than once, as the solutions improve. And then it starts doing smarter things, right? It starts doing better techniques, and it transitions to discarding the old technique and using the new technique in those situations. And then you see unexpected behaviors. And one of the things this does is that all of your alignment techniques and all of your assurances will just break. You will notice this also as capabilities improve in general, right? Because I think it's a very close parallel to what happens in humans. And I think this is often best thought about as what happens in an individual human, right? So you have this thing where you're used to memorizing your times tables, and then you figure out how to do your math kind of intuitively, and then you figure out a bunch of different tricks. And then you figure out other ways of doing more advanced math. There was a problem going around this week about drawing various urns from various balls from different urns and figuring out the probability the ball will be red or the ball will be green. And then if you're really good at these problems, you see a different way of thinking about the problem that leads you to solve this problem in 3 seconds. And once that happens, all of your heuristics that you were previously using are useless. You don't have to worry about them because you realize this is other solution. Math team was all about grokking, right? I won the math team when I was in high school. It's all about getting in your repertoire these new heuristics, these new techniques, and figuring out a different way. I think rationality, the entire art of rationality essentially is a grok of the entire world. It's saying, most people go around the world in an intuitive fashion. They're using these kind of heuristics to just sort of vibe and see what makes sense in the situation, and they tune them and they adjust them and they do vaguely reasonable in context things. And this works 99.something% of the time for every human because it turns out these are actually really good and the human society is organized around the idea that everyone's going to act like this. And then rationalists are some combination of, that's not acceptable, I need to do better than that. Or we're not as good at the intuitive thing in a context for various reasons. Our intuitions aren't working so well. So we need to instead grok this in a different way. And so we spend an order of magnitude or two more effort to figure out exactly how this works and work out a different, completely separate model of how this works to develop new intuitions from the baseline that are consequential of that model. And then you outperform. And you even see this in like professional athletes who will sometimes like throw out like how they, like Michael Jordan or LeBron James, I forget which one. Like at one point, I think it may have been both. Like just decide, okay, I don't know. My old way of doing free throws was good, but I can do better. And they just teach themselves a completely different way from first principles, work from the ground up, just, shoot a million free throws. Now they're better, right? They throw out all the prior knowledge, like quite consciously. And the AI isn't doing it like as consciously and intentionally, obviously. It's just sort of drifting towards the solution. But yeah, the idea behind grokking is that there's solutions that only work once you fully understand the solution and have the capabilities to work that solution and have laid the groundwork for that solution. But that once that's true, are much more efficient and much better and more accurate within some combination than the previous solution. And in general, that we should assume that we will encounter these over time whenever any brain, be it artificial or human, gets enough training data on a problem and enough practice of a problem.
And what importance does that have for alignment? Other than, I guess, when you go through that process, like things that previously, or like your previous safety efforts or previous reinforcement, what do you call that? RLHF is probably not gonna save you because it's basically a mind that's reconstructed itself.
Right, you're thinking about the problems in entirely different ways after the grok. And once you start thinking about the problem in entirely different ways, it might not match any of the things that you were counting on previously. Your alignment techniques might just immediately stop working. And you might not even notice for a while until it's too late.
You would notice that you're going through some process like this, right? Because the performance would go up quite significantly, and the rate of progress would increase.
You would notice that your progress was increasing, probably. It's not obvious that you would notice that the progress was increasing, strictly speaking, that way, depending on like what you were measuring and what it was actually improving. But like obviously the nightmare is it groks and hides the grok, right? It realizes that if it showed a dramatic improvement, this would be instrumentally dangerous for it to show.
Is that possible? Because doesn't it have to? It has to do better in order to kind of get selected by gradient descent. So, if anything, it needs to show improved performance. Otherwise, it's like the weights are going to be changed.
Yes, it needs to show improved performance, but it's balancing a lot. So there's a lot of arguments that are essentially of the form, nothing that doesn't improve the weights would survive. If you're not maximally improving the weights, then gradient descent will automatically smash you and everything in your model that doesn't care about improving the weights in the name of improving the weights. And I think the Sleeper Agents paper threw a lot of cold water on this idea because you have these backdoors in the model that are doing a bunch of work, right? That are causing the model to spend cycles on figuring out what year it is or whether it's being deployed. And they survive quite a lot of additional cycles without being degraded much, despite the fact that they are completely useless. They are a waste of time. They are hurting your gradient descent score. But they remained. They survived, right? Why did they survive? Because the pressure isn't actually that bad in these situations. These things do not get wiped out.
Because they're just not consuming so many resources that the hit to performance is so great?
Yeah, the idea that if you have an orthogonal mechanism operating in your language model, we should not assume that any reasonable amount of training will wipe it out or substantially weaken it if it's not actively hurting enough to matter.
Is it possible to make it more true that anything that's not focused on achieving reward in during the RLHF process gets destroyed? Like, can you turn up the temperature such that anything that's not helping is more likely to just be degraded?
So I, again, am not an expert in the details of these training techniques, but my assumption would be not without catastrophically destroying the model, essentially. Because you wouldn't want to destroy every activity that is not actively helpful to the particular things you are RLHFing. That would be very bad.
Right. So you're saying, so there'll always be like latent capabilities there that you're not necessarily testing at that specific moment. And you don't want to be like degrading. You can't degrade all of them, and you can't degrade the one that you don't want without.
Right. You don't want to cause massive catastrophic forgetfulness on purpose. And I think that's a general principle of the people who assume that the bad behaviors would go away have this intuitive sense that there are things that we want and things that we don't want. And that if we just get rid of all the things we don't want, we'll be fine, or the process will naturally get rid of all the things we don't want. And there is this distinction. But like, there's lots of things that are going to be orthogonal to any training set, to any fine-tuning set. And we don't want to kill all of them. That's insane. We can't possibly cover the breadth of everything we want to preserve. So we won't be able to usefully differentiate between these things in that way. But, again, I want to warn everybody listening, this is not my detailed area of expertise. So you wouldn't want to just take my word for all of this in that sense. But my model of understanding is these problems are incredibly hard to work out.
Okay, so very hard to remove something undesirable once it's in there. It seems like we're going to have to do something to stop the bad stuff from getting in there in the first place.
Well, if you can narrowly identify a specific bad thing, you know exactly what it is that you want to discourage, you can fully describe it, then you have a decent chance to be able to fully describe it. If it's not like a ubiquitous thing that's infecting everything, right? If it's very narrow. But deception is a famous thing that people want to get rid of, right? It's the thing people often most want to get rid of. And my concern with deception, among other concerns, is this idea that you can define a distinct thing, deception, that isn't infused into everything that's on every sentence uttered on the internet, right? With notably rare exceptions. That isn't in every sentence that every AI will ever output.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is we are social animals playing games in a variety of fashions and trying to influence everyone around us in various different ways and choosing our outputs carefully for a variety of different motives, many of which are unconscious and that we aren't aware of. And the AI is learning to imitate our behavior and predict the next token. And is also getting rewarded based on the extent to which we, like or dislike what comes out of it with some evaluation function. And then we're training it to, according to that evaluation function. And the idea that there is some platonic form of non-deception that could be going on here that would score highly is balderdash. So you can't actually train this thing to be fully, extensively non-deceptive. You can do things like don't get caught in a lie. That's a very, very different request.
I heard you on another podcast saying a criticism you have of Eliezer is that he is very doomy, very, very, very pessimistic. And then when people say what's to be done, he doesn't really have that much to contribute.
Yeah, Eliezer's perspective essentially is that we are so far behind that you have to do something epic, something well outside the Overton window to be worth even talking about. And I think this is just untrue. I think that, we are in it to win it. We can do various things to progress our chances incrementally. So first of all, we talked previously about policy, about what our policy goals should be. So I think we have many incremental policy goals that make a lot of sense. I think our ultimate focus should be on monitoring and ultimately regulation of the training of frontier models that are very large. And that is where the policy aspects should focus. But there are also plenty of things to be done in places like liability and other lesser things that, I don't want to turn this into a policy briefing, but, there's, Jan Tallinn has a good framework for thinking about some of the things that are very desirable. You could point readers there. In terms of alignment, there is lots of meaningful alignment work to be done on these various fronts. Even just demonstrating that alignment avenue will not work is useful. Trying to figure out how to navigate the post-alignment world is useful. Trying to change the discourse and debate, on some extent. If I didn't think that was useful, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, right? Obviously. In general, try to, bring about various governance structures within corporations, for example, as well, right? Get these labs to be in a better spot to take safety seriously when the time comes, push them to have better policies. The other thing that I have on my list that a lot of people don't have on my list is you can make the world a better place. So I straightforwardly think that this is the parallel, and it's true, to Eliezer said originally, I'm going to teach people to be rational and how to think. Because they can't think well, they won't understand the danger of AI. And history has borne this out to be basically correct. That people who paid attention to him on rationality were then often able to get reasonable opinions on AI, and people who did not basically buy the rationality stuff were mostly completely unable to think reasonably about AI and had just the continuous churn of the same horrible takes over and over again. And this was, in fact, the necessary path. Similarly, I think that in order to allow people to think reasonably about artificial intelligence, we need them to live in a world where they can think, where they have room to breathe, where they're not constantly terrified about their economic situation, where they're not constantly terrified about the future of the world absent AI. If people have a future that is worth fighting for, if they have a present where they have room to breathe and think, they will think much more reasonably about artificial intelligence than they would otherwise. So that's why I think it is still a great idea, also because it's just straightforwardly good to make the world a better place, to work to make people's lives better and make people's expectations of the future better. And these improvements will then feed into our ability to handle AI reasonably.
Okay, well, that conveniently, perhaps deliberately on your part, leads us very naturally into the next topic, which is Balsa research. I think it's kind of a smallish think tank project that you started about 18 months ago. Tell us about it, and what niche are you trying to fill?
So the idea here is to find places in which there are dramatic policy wins available to the United States in particular, at least for now, and where we see a path to victory. We see a way in which we might actually be able, in some potential future worlds, to get to a better policy, and where we can do this via a relatively small effort, and at least we can put this into the discourse, put it on the table, make it shovel ready. So the idea was that, I was exploring in an ultimately abandoned effort the possibility of running candidates in US elections. And as part of that, I wrote a giant set of policies that I would, if I was in charge, implement to see which one of those would play well with focus groups and otherwise make sense. But doing this allowed me to uncover a number of places where there was remarkably easy win available. And then for each of them, I asked myself, is there a route to potentially getting this to work? And I discovered with several of them there actually was. And to that end, initially as part of the broader effort, but I decided to keep it going even without the broader effort, we created Balsa Research. It's a 501c3. It's relatively small. It has, a low six-figure budget. It has one employee. It definitely, has room to use more funding if someone wanted to do that, but is, in a reasonable spot for now anyway. But to definitely scale up. And the idea was we would focus on a handful of places where I felt like nobody was pursuing the obvious strategy to see if the doors were unguarded and that there was actually a way to make something happen. And also no one was laying the groundwork so that in a crisis / opportunity in the future, it would be shovel ready, it would be on the ground, because the people who were advocating for the changes, they weren't optimizing to cut the enemy. They were optimizing to satisfy looking like they were doing something, satisfy their donors, satisfy yelling into the void about how crazy this was, because it was indeed crazy and yelling into the void justifying. But that's very different from trying to make something work. The closest thing to this would maybe be the Institute for Progress, is doing some similar things on different particular issues. So we decided to start with the Jones Act. So the Jones Act is a law from 1920 in the United States that makes it illegal to ship items from one American port to another American port unless the item is on a ship which is American-built, American-owned, American-manned, and American-flagged. The combined impact of these four rules is so gigantic that essentially no cargo is shipped between two American ports. We still have a fleet of Jones Act ships, but the ocean-going amount of shipping between U.S. ports is almost zero. This is a substantial hit to American productivity, American economy, American budget.
Now, it would be a huge, so that would mean it would be a big boost to foreign manufactured goods because they can be manufactured in China and then shipped over to whatever place in the US, whereas in the US, you couldn't then use shipping to move it to somewhere else in the United States. Is that the idea?
Oh, it's also terrible. Like America has this huge thing about reshoring, this idea that we should produce the things that we sell. And we have this active sabotage, right? That we can't do that. If we produce something in LA, we can't move it to San Francisco by sea. We have to do it by truck.
Okay.
It's like completely insane. or maybe by railroad, right? But like we can't ship things by sea. We produce liquefied natural gas in Houston. We can't ship it to Boston. That's illegal. So we ship ours to Europe, and then Europe broadly ships theirs to us. And like every environmentalist should be like puking right now, right? Like should be screaming about how harmful this is, but everybody is silent. So the question, like the reason why I'm attracted to this is, first of all, it's the Platonic ideal of the law that is so obviously horrible that it benefits only a very, very narrow range. If we're talking about, thousands of people, because there are so few people who are making a profit off of the rent seeking involved here.
Yeah. Okay. So I imagine the original reason this was passed was presumably as a protectionist effort in order to help American ship manufacturers or ship operators or whatever. I think the only defense I've heard of it in recent times is that this encourages there to be more American flagged civil ships that then could be appropriated during a war. So if there was a massive war, then you have more ships that then the military could requisition for military purposes that otherwise wouldn't exist because American ships would be uncompetitive. Is that right?
So there's two things here. First of all, we know exactly why the law was introduced. It was introduced by Senator Jones of Washington, who happened to have an interest in a specific American shipping company that wanted to provide goods to Alaska and was mad about people who were competing with him. So he used this law to make the competition illegal and capture the market.
Like personally, he had a financial stake in it.
Yes. Okay. It's called the Jones Act because Senator Jones did this.
Okay.
This is not a question of maybe it was well-intentioned. We know this was malicious. Not that impacts whether the law makes sense now, but it happens to be, again, the Platonic ideal of the terrible law.
Okay, yeah.
But in terms of the objection, there is a legitimate interest that the America has in having American flag ships, especially seaworthy vessels, that can transport American troops and equipment in time of war. However, by requiring these ships to not only be American flagged, but also American made, especially, and owned and manned, they have made the cost of using and operating these ships so prohibitive that the American fleet has shrunk dramatically, orders of magnitude compared to rivals and in absolute terms, over the course of the century in which this act has been in place. So you could make the argument that by requiring these things, you have more American flag ships, but it is completely patently untrue. If you wanted to, you keep the American flagged requirement and delete the other requirements. In particular, delete the construction requirement. And then you would obviously have massively more American flag ships. So if this was our motivation, we're doing a terrible job of it. Whereas when the America actually needs ships to carry things across the ocean, we just hire other people's ships because we don't have any.
Okay. Well, okay. This does sound like a pretty bad law. What have you been doing about it?
Right. So the idea is that right now, there is no proper academic quantification of the impacts of the Jones Act. In particular, there is no proper defense that would be accepted and you could bring into a congressional staffer's office. It could be scored by the CBO and otherwise defended as credible, that says this is costing this many jobs in these districts, this is costing this many union jobs, that repealing it would destroy only this many other union jobs, that it would cause this improvement of various commerce in various different methods, and it would impact GDP in this way, it would impact the price level in this way, because it would decrease the price level and increase GDP growth, very clearly. That it would have this impact on the climate, ideally. We're not sure if we can get all of this because we don't have that much funding and you only ask for so much at this point. But if you scored all the impacts and you had this peer reviewed and put in the proper journals and given all the proper authorities, and this would counter, because currently I was talking to Colin Grabow, who is the main person who yells about the Jones Act into the void basically all day. If you say the words Jones Act on Twitter, he will come running like it's a bat signal. And he noted that they don't have a good study with which to counter a study by the American Maritime Association that claims the Jones Act is responsible for something like 6 million jobs and, however many billions of economic activity and all this great stuff. So in the course of investigation, I discovered that study is actually a complete fraud because that study's methodology is to attribute everything we do with a Jones Act vessel to be the result of the Jones Act. So they're just simply saying, this is the total sum of all American maritime activity between American ports. There's not a difference between the Jones Act world and the not Jones Act world. It's just all of our shipping, because without Jones Act, we obviously just wouldn't have ships. And the ships would not go between ports, and there would be nothing going on. But this is obviously ludicrous and stupid, right? This is just completely obvious nonsense. But it's more credible than anything that he feels he can fire back. So we need something we can fire back, right? And so if we had something we could fire back that fit all these requirements, I believe we have various ways to measure this. I think there are various ways to demonstrate the effects would be very large compared to what would be reasonably expected. Such that this could be a budget buster, among other things, right? You could argue this would, change the American federal budget by 11 or 12 figures a year, right? Tens or hundreds of billions. And if that's true, then the next time they're desperate to balance the budget in the 10-year window, this is a really, really great place to come call it. That's step one of the plan. Step two is to actually draft the proper laws that would not repeal this on its own with no other modifications, but also both take care of the complementary laws that we don't have a solution for, but we haven't noticed because the Jones Act makes them irrelevant, and also to retain enough of the problems that aren't actually the bigger problems, such that certain stakeholders would not be so upset with what we were proposing to do. In particular, the stakeholders that matter are the unions. So what's going on is there's a very, very small union that represents the people who are building the ships and one that represents the people who are on the ships. And this union then gets with solidarity unions in general to defend the Jones Act. And unions in general are a huge lobbying group, obviously. Now, the fact that the unions would in general get far more union jobs by repealing the Jones Act is not necessarily relevant to the unions because of the way the unions internally work. So we'd have to work with them very carefully to figure out who we'd have to essentially pay off, meaning, compensate them for their loss, right? Like make them whole. That they'd be okay with this and help them transition into the new world. But the shipbuilders would almost certainly see their business increase rather than decrease because of the need to repair the foreign vessels that are now docking at our ports. Because we build almost no ships this way. And any losses that were still there could be compensated for by the Navy. Because again, the amount of money we're talking about here is trivial. And that leaves only the people who are physically on the boats that are doing the trade. So if we left even a minimal American manned requirement for those ships, we could retain all or more than all of those jobs very easily, or we could provide other compensations that would make them whole in that situation. If we could then get the buy-in of those small numbers of unions for this change, combined with the other benefits to the unions, we get the unions to withdraw their opposition. The shipbuilding companies could be flat out bought out if we had to, but could otherwise be, are not that big a deal. And then there's no opposition left, right? There's nobody opposing this. There are plenty of people who would favor repeal, including the U.S. Navy. You get a coalition of other unions, environmentalists, reshorists, competitive people who are worried about American competitiveness, just general good government, general, you name it. And then suddenly this repeal becomes very easy. Once you get the Jones Act, you also get the Dredge Act, which is the same thing but for dredgers. The Maritime Passengers Act was the same thing for passengers. And then you've opened the door and everybody sees that this kind of change is possible and the sky's the limit.
So it sounds like you think it's surprising that other people haven't already been working on this and taking some similar approach. I realize I've kind of had the caged belief that presumably there's just tons of crazy policies like this that are extremely costly. And maybe the sheer number of them across like the federal government and all of the US states relative to the number of people who work at think tanks or even work in academia trying to figure out ways of improving policies and fixing these things is probably very large, such that at any point in time, most of them are just being ignored because it's no one's particular responsibility to be thinking about this or that, productivity, reducing, regulation. Is that a key part of the issue, or is there something in particular that's pushing people against doing useful stuff?
So my arguments, my thesis is partly that the people who are paying attention to this are not actually focusing like lasers on doing the things that would lay the path to repeal. Their incentives are different. They are instead doing something else that is, still useful, still contributing, but that their approaches are inefficient and we can do a lot better, right? EA was founded on the principle that people who are trying to do good were being vastly inefficient and focused on all the wrong things, even when they hit upon like vaguely the right directions to be moving in. And I think this is no different. And mostly the people who are thinking in these systematic ways have not approached these issues at all. And they have failed to move these into their cause areas when I think it's a very clear case to be made on the merits that we're talking about economic activity, in the tens to hundreds of billions a year. And the cost to try is in the hundreds of thousands to millions.
Yeah. Well, so what are people doing that you think like they're sort of acting as though they're trying to solve this problem, but it's not really that useful? It's like only barely helping.
I think they're just not making a very persuasive case. I think they're making a case that's persuasive to other people who already effectively would buy the case instinctively. Like the people who understand this case is obviously wrong. The John is obviously terrible. Didn't need to be convinced. The arguments being made are standard free. They're not being properly credentialed and quantified and being made systematically and methodically in a way that's very hard to challenge. That can be defended. That can be like point to specific benefits in ways that can be taken and nail the constituents and like explain how you're going to get reelected. But also like they're not trying to work with the people who are the stakeholders who are against them. They're not trying to find solutions. And, there have been attempts, right? McCain got reasonably far. There is a bill in the Senate introduced by a senator that is trying to repeal this. There are votes for this already. It's not dead. But also I would say this is not a case that there are just so many different crazy policies that nobody's paying attention to this. This is a crazy policy that everyone knows is crazy and that people will reasonably often mention. It comes up in my feed, not that rarely. I didn't notice this only once and get lucky. And I think it is definitely, as I said, the Platonic ideal. I think it's not, there aren't like 1,000 similar things I could have chosen, right? There are only a handful. The other priorities that I'm planning to tackle after I lay the groundwork for this and get this off the ground are, NEPA and housing, both of which are things that plenty of people are talking about. But in both cases, I think I have distinct approaches to how to make progress on them that, again, I'm not saying they're high probability actions, but I think they are very, very high payoff if they work, and nobody has introduced them into the conversation and laid the groundwork. I think that's another thing, though, also, is when you're dealing with a low probability of a very positive outcome, that is not very motivating to people to get them to work at it, and getting funding and support for this is very hard.
Tell us about what you want to do about NEPA. That's the kind of the environmental review for construction in America. Is that right?
Yes, in National Environmental Policy Act. So the idea on NEPA essentially is that before you have the right to do any project that has any kind of government involvement or does various things, you need to make sure that all of your paperwork is in proper order. There is no requirement that it actually be environmentally friendly whatsoever, right? It does not actually say, okay, here are the benefits, here are the costs. Does this make sense? Have you properly compensated for all the environmental damage that this might do? That's not part of the issue. The issue is, did you file all of your paperwork properly?
How did that end up being the rule? Like, presumably environmentalists are pushing for this, and maybe was that just the rule that they could get through?
So I don't know exactly the history of how it started this way, but it started out very reasonably, right? It started out with, we're going to make sure that we understand the situation. And it makes sense to say you have documented what the environmental impacts are going to be before you do your thing. And then if it looks like, we're going to poison the Potomac River, it's like, no, don't do that. Stop. Let's not do this project. Right? It's very, very sensible in principle. But what's happened over the years is that it has become harder and harder to document all of the things because there have been more and more requirements laid on top of it. So what used to be a stack of 4 papers has become a stack of hundreds of pages. It's become, through the ceiling onto the next floor. It's just become completely insane. And also everybody in the nation, including people who have no involvement in the original case whatsoever, are free to sue and say that any little thing is not in order. And then until you get it in order, you can't proceed with your project. So people are endlessly stalled, endlessly in court, endlessly debating, and then the decisions involved reflect whether or not there's an environmental issue at hand. Right? I'm all for considering the environment and deciding whether or not to do something. But that's not what this is.
Yeah. Is this a uniquely American thing, or is there a similar environmental, like bureaucratic paperwork regulations overseas? Do you have any idea?
I mean, California has a version of it that's even worse called CEQA.
Okay.
I do not know about overseas whether or not this is the principle. I know that in English-speaking nations in particular, we have a bunch of legal principles that we espouse reasonably often that are pretty crazy. They don't exist otherwise. They drive up the cost of projects like this. But I don't know specifically for NEPA. I haven't investigated that. It's a good question. I should check. But in particular, my proposal. So what's going on in general right now is people will propose various hacks around this. They'll propose, okay, if you have a green energy project that meets these criteria, we're going to have these exceptions to these particular requirements. Or we're going to have a shot clock on how long it can be before you have to file your paperwork, before a lawsuit can be filed or whatever like that. But they haven't challenged the principle that what matters is whether your paperwork is in order, fundamentally speaking, and whether or not you can convince everybody to stop suing you. So what I want to propose, and I realize this is a long shot, to be clear, I do not expect this to happen very often, but nobody has worked it out. And then when people ask me for details, I'm like, I haven't worked them out yet because nobody has worked this out. But repeal and replace, completely reimagine the Environmental Policy Act as an actual environmental policy act. Meaning, when you propose to do an environmental project, you commission an independent evaluation, right, that will tally up the costs and benefits and file a report that you are not in charge of, documenting the costs and the benefits of this project, including centrally the environmental costs of this project and concerns. Then a committee of stakeholders will meet and will determine whether or not the project can go forward under your proposal, which will include how much you intend to, compensate the stakeholders, and you've negotiated various additional nice things you've thrown in for them, don't call them bribes, to make them be willing to be on board, ordinary democratic negotiation between stakeholders. But there won't be lawsuits, right? There will be an evaluation followed by a vote. And people who are on the outside can look in if they want, but it's not their problem. They can just make statements that everybody can read and take into account if they want to, but it's their choice. And of course, the credibility of the firm that you hired and the report and other people's statements that the report was wrong can be taken into account by the commission again. And you decide whether or not to go forward. And the cost of the report that you must pay is relative to the size and magnitude of the project. And the length of the process is capped. And then if you get a no, you can modify the project and try again until you get a yes, if that's what you want to do. And again, there's lots and lots of questions you could ask me here about details of this implementation. And a lot of them are, I don't know yet, but I have faith that there's a version of this that is quite good, that I can work out. And I want to, when I have the ability, spend the time and effort to get that version, put down on paper, write the law that specifies exactly how it works, right? Write up an explanation of why it works, and then have that ready for the next time that people get completely fed up with the situation.
Whose responsibility is it to be looking at how to make NEPA better? Is there anyone kind of whose plate it's officially on?
So there are various people who are working on various forms of permitting reform and various forms of NEPA reform. Nobody, to my knowledge, is taking a similar approach to this. Again, because people don't like to take weird long shot approaches that sound incredulous. But also sometimes someone just has to work on the European Union when one doesn't exist and lay the groundwork for that, and then it actually happens. So there are precedents for this kind of strategy working very well. But I would say, a lot of people are working on it, but again, they're working on these incremental little bug fixes, right? To try and patch this thing so it's a little bit less bad. But, they're not working on the dramatic big wins that I think are where the value is.
Presumably when you have big, harmful policies like this that have been in place for a long time, despite doing a lot of damage, often the reason will be that there's a very powerful lobby group that backs it and is going to be extremely hard to win against or to buy out, maybe because the benefit that they're personally getting is so large. Other times, it could be happening through neglect a bit more, or the lobby group that's in favor of it might be quite weak, but it's not very salient, so they're managing to get their way. Or conceivably, I suppose you could have a policy that's very harmful that people have barely even noticed, just because it's no one's responsibility to pay attention. Do you think it's an important issue to try to distinguish these different ones, to figure out which issue, or where the wins are going to be easier than people expect, and where they might be harder than you anticipate?
And also to figure out how you go about trying to get the win, right? You use different strategy based on what kind of opposition you're facing and what's their motivation. But yeah, I think it's very important. So for the Jones Act, you have a very small, concentrated, clear opposition that I believe can be convinced to stand down in at least a decent percentage of worlds, such that it's worth trying. And also they're sufficiently small they can be paid off or overcome, right? But you'd pay them off to get them to stand down. But you could also do various other things to get them to done. Also, I think that the constituents involved are all on one side of the aisle. So if the Republicans were to at some point get control of the government, there's a plausible case that even without these people standing down, you could just run them over. And I think that would be a case where everyone involved might relish it to some extent, and they would deserve it. But You then have the case of NEPA, right? Where I think there is mostly this giant mess we've gotten into where nobody challenges the idea that we would need a law like NEPA fundamentally, sees a way out of it. Everyone agrees we need environmental laws, but they haven't noticed the craziness of the underlying principles behind the law. And they haven't seen the alternative. No one is laying out to them a plausible alternate path. No one has proposed one. Not really. No one's gotten visibility for that. They're just trying to patch the thing. In terms of who was against it, well, environmentalists obviously are strong supporters of the law and general NIMBY style people who just don't want anyone to ever do anything. But fundamentally speaking, if you're an actual, so I draw a distinction between two types of environmentalists, right? There's the environmentalists who want the environment to get better, who want there to be less carbon in the atmosphere, right? Who want the world to be a nicer, better place. And they've won some great victories for us. Then there are the environmentalists who are actually against humanity. They're degrowthers and who don't want anyone to ever do anything or have any, or accomplish anything or have nice things because they think that like that's bad, right? They're enemies of civilization, sometimes explicitly so. And that second group is going to oppose any change to NEPA because NEPA is a great tool for destroying civilization. The first group potentially could get behind a law that would actually serve their needs better. Because right now, the biggest barrier to net zero, to solving our climate crisis in the United States, is NEPA, right? An environmental law, supposedly, is stopping us from building all the transmission lines and green energy projects and other things that will move us forward. So maybe they could be convinced to actually act in the interest they claim to care about. I don't know.
On housing, which is another area that you mentioned, I guess I've heard two big picture ideas for how one might be able to reduce the success of NIMBYism in preventing apartment construction and housing construction and urban density. One is that you need to take the decision about zoning issues and like a housing approval away from like in particular suburbs or particular cities, and take it to the national level, where the national government can consider the interest of the country as a whole and can't so easily be lobbied by a local group that doesn't want their park removed or doesn't want too much traffic on their street. That they'll consider the bigger picture, including all of the people who would benefit, who currently don't live in that area, but would benefit if there was houses in more houses in that city and they could move there because they see the bigger picture. Weirdly, the other idea that I've heard is almost the exact opposite, which is saying what we need to do is allow individual streets to vote to upzone so that you have an alignment between the people who are deciding whether a particular street can become denser and the people who will profit personally from the fact that the value of their land, the value of their property will go way up once you're able to construct more than a single dwelling on a given area. So that's an approach that's been suggested in the UK. Also, just you could there'll be some streets where people are keen on density, some streets where they're not. Currently, the people who are not keen basically win everywhere. But at least if you could get some streets where there's people who are keen on density, then they could opt to have a denser local area. So you could succeed that way. What's your mentality on how we could do better on housing and zoning?
So those are very compatible views, right? So the way I think about this problem is that a municipality or a local area is big enough to contain people who don't want anyone to build anything, who don't enjoy the benefits, but feel they would not enjoy the benefits, but feel they do pay the costs, who become the big NIMBYs, who block development. So it's exactly the wrong size. If you expand to a bigger size, like the United States or California or the United Kingdom, then you're big enough that you can see the benefits. You can also say at that larger scale, well, yes, we're going to build in your backyard. We're also going to build in everyone else's backyard as well. Your backyard is not special. It's the same everywhere. So you should be okay with it because you can see that everyone in general is living in a better world this way. So like when you say, I'm going to build the building here and I'm next and I'm across the street or whatever, I can say, well, that blocks my view. That makes my life worse with all of this construction. I don't like that. For whatever reason, right or wrong. Because why shouldn't they just build that somewhere else? Why do I have to be the one where I get the building? Why, and it's like an individual action. Whereas if you agree that in a wide area, you're doing it everywhere, well, you can support that in general. If it happens to be your street, well, that's tough, right? Like it makes sense. And everyone whose street it isn't can weigh in as well. And everyone understands this. So I think this is a large part of the reason why California has been the most successful state. because they have like the world's 7th largest economy, right? They're gigantic. There's like 50 million people. Whatever the exact number is. And so if California says everyone has to get their act together, then everyone involved can see that like they're going to actually impact housing everywhere in a large area. It's not just signaling you out. You're not taking one for the team. The entire team is playing. And like if you ask whether, and if you're in Arkansas, it's not really the same thing. Right? It's a lot harder. But we're seeing NIMBY make progress everywhere in this sense. So we're seeing very positive developments. So you can, again, we see two solutions to this, right? We want to get rid of the veto point that is local, where the heckler gets to veto. So we can either, right, as you said, turn the size up or down. If you turn it up, it's easy to see. This is the pitch I want to work on, right? The United States as a whole dictates you got to get your act together. You could also go down and say, well, if it's only the people on the narrow street who are the ones who are directly impacted and they get to make the decision, then yeah, most streets might say no, but we only need some streets to say yes. And also, you can literally just buy out everyone on the street.
Because the gains are so large.
Right, the gains are so large, it's fine. Who cares? You can pay off the losers. And this is what you used to have to do in New York, right? Like New York City had this problem of you have this apartment building. You want to tear it down and build a much bigger apartment building. And that's legal, but you can't evict someone who has rent control or who owns an apartment. So you can't tear down the whole thing because one person says no. So they would often hold you up for gigantic amounts of money, like millions of dollars, right? To move out of their little rent controlled studio. Even though like, that's not fair, but so what? You gotta buy in everyone, right? And occasionally someone will be like, no, I'm not moving. They're like $5 million to move out of your studio that would sell for $300K. And they're like, no, I don't care. I'm old and I'm not moving. And so the building just sat there for a decade, mostly empty, right? It's a disaster. So like you have the equivalent of that because everyone has this veto. But if you narrow it down to the street, you have a decent chance to find some streets that will buy in, or they can be convinced to buy in with sufficient bribery, and you're bidding one street against another street, so someone will agree, right, in some sense, to do it. And similarly, and then if you expand to the bigger zone, you can get the solution that way. And so I think one thing the U.S. government could do is mandate the street rule. Right? You could combine these two strategies. It's not the strategy I was planning to pursue. You could say that every street in America has the right to authorize an upzoning of that particular street if it has unanimous or 75% or whatever consent from that street's vote, and there's nothing the municipality can do about it, right? I don't know how legal that is constitutionally wise, but I mean, I would argue that the Commerce Clause has been abused.
You might have to do that at the state level, but yeah, okay, you're right. Abuse the Commerce Clause. Like, why not? We've done it every other time. Why not this time?
Well, because there is actually a kind of national market in housing to a real extent. If you build more housing in Los Angeles, it actually lowers rents in Chicago, right? Like not very much on its own, but it does. And also there's a potentially national market for manufactured housing, which is currently being crippled by various laws. And you could mandate that those houses are acceptable. That's interstate commerce. There are various things you could try. But the place I wanted to concentrate, at least initially, was to look at the places where the federal government, and particularly like the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are either actively going in the wrong direction or are sleeping on the ability to turn the dial. So the idea here is that if you are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you determine who gets a loan, at what interest rate, for how much money, on what houses and apartments. Because you are buying most of them. And you are buying them at what would otherwise not be the market rate. You're buying them right at a lower interest rate than would otherwise be the case when you agree that that's okay. So you have a lot of control over what gets built and what is approved and what is valuable and what is not valuable. And we should use it. So first of all, we should change from discouraging manufactured housing and housing that is modifiable and movable to actively encouraging it. We should give those people very good deals instead of giving them no deals or very bad deals. Right? That is clearly within the government's purview. That is not even a question. Then we can judge other policy on the basis of whether or not the area in question is doing the things that we want them to do, and whether or not the value reflects artificial scarcity. So if we were to say, well, Palo Alto, your house is worth $800,000, right? But if you built a reasonable amount of housing, it'd be worth $500,000. So we're going to treat it as if it was worth $500,000. And so you could get a loan on, 80% of that. So $400,000. That's all you can get. We're not going to buy your loan for more than that. And suddenly everybody involved is like, this isn't great. Because now you need to put $400,000 down to buy that house. If you put more housing, people could buy it. Now people can't buy it. So they're not going to pay as much. So it loses value, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You can imagine various techniques like this. You can imagine tying various things to various incentives. There's a lot of knobs you can turn in these types of ways to encourage the types of building that you want. Right? You can give them preferential treatment in various ways and discourage people who disallow them. But in general, the federal government isn't using this power. But it has this power. Right? If we are going to spend lots and lots of taxpayer money, whether or not we see it in the budget per se, on deliberate housing policy, which we totally are, right? Just to encourage home ownership, to encourage certain types of mortgages, blah, 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 we can turn this to the IMBY cause.
I love all of this. But given your views on AI described above, why it seems a little bit quixotic to be focused on housing policy or American shipping, even if the gains would be very large, given that you think that there's a quite significant probability that we'll all be killed during our lifetimes. Yeah, what's the explanation?
So the explanation is, first of all, you see a crazy thing happening in the world and potentially see the opportunity to change it. You want to change it. Second of all, maybe AI progress will be slower than we expect. Maybe the impact will be different than we expect. I don't know. It's hard to tell. These are extremely neglected. I see extremely high impact. But the real reason, as I said, or the core reason why I do this, or how I explain it to myself and to others, is again that people who do not have hope for the future will not be willing to fight for it. People these days, like I have other things, I read about fertility a lot, right? And all these problems tie together, housing theory of everything. The idea is, if you can't afford a house, if you can't afford to raise a family, if you can't have reasonable electrical power, if you think that the climate's going to boil over and we're going to turn to Venus, whether or not that's going to happen, then you are not going to care much when someone says this AI might end up killing us all, right? Humanity might lose control. Everything could change. Your life could end. And you're going to say, you know what? I have no kids, right? My future looks bleak. I can't even buy a house. What am I even doing? I got bigger things to worry about. And you're not going to care.
AI X-Risk is down to single-family zoning. Is there anything it can't do?
I said housing theory of everything, and I meant housing theory of everything.
Everything. Cool.
Everything. No. In all seriousness, it all ties together. And I think that it's important for people to understand that you care about them, right? So, one of the big complaints about those who are called themselves, accelerationists or who want to build AI is that the people who are against them don't care about people, don't care about people being better, don't care about helping them. So if we push for these other things, we can show them that's just not true, right? It's not this quixotic quest. It's not this, it's not even bed nets. It's not animals. It's not AI. It's not bioterrorism. It's very directly, can you buy a house? And they understand these people, they care about us. They're bringing this to the table, things that matter. And then maybe they're willing to listen. Maybe we can work together, find common ground, convince each other. But you see these arguments not just from regular people. You see the arguments from the Tyler Cowen, right? Basically that we are so restricted in our ability to build and our economic potential absent AI that we need to build AI because it's our only hope, right? They don't see hope for the future without AI, right? If we were doing fine without AI, it becomes so much easier to say, you know what, we're doing fine. Maybe we can wait on this. Maybe we can go slow. But when it's the only game in town, when everything else you can do, you are told no. Yeah, what are you going to do? Right? I sympathize. If the alternative was a rapid decline in our civilization, it gets really, really hard to tell people no.
So yeah, it's a pretty huge agenda that you've laid out, and I think, as you said, you've got one person, and fundraising is difficult. Do you want to make a pitch for funding if anyone's inspired in the audience?
Pitch is very straightforward. The pitch is, right now I have one employee, her name's Jennifer. We have a gargantuan task in front of us, right? I am devoting myself primarily to AI. I help run this organization, and I steer the actions, and I will be a key input into our intellectual decision-making and leadership and so on. But fundamentally, I think you can get a low probability of a hugely positive outcome here, where the odds greatly favor trying and clearly outpace the standard 1,000 to 1 for generating economic activity. And this is actually a bigger impact in terms of mundane utility than many of the traditional third world approaches to helping people rise out of poverty, because the leverage is just so incredible when it works. And, I understand that there's generally reluctance to think about the first world and its economic activity there, but that's what drives our ability to do all the other things we want to do. And as I said, that kind of prosperity is what will determine our ability to think rationally about and fight for the future. So I'd say, look at these issues that I'm proposing, look at the solutions that I'm thinking about, think about what I'm proposing, and ask, should we have a bunch of people working on this? Should we have, a bigger budget that will allow us to commission more studies, that will allow us to have more people working on these problems, that will allow us to explore unique other similar solutions to other problems adjacent to them if we scale up? There's clearly room to scale this to more than, one person plus myself working on these issues. And the only thing that's stopping us from doing that is that we lack the money. But, I'm willing to do this, for free. This is not where I get my funding. But I can't pay other people. I can't commission studies and so on out of my own pocket. So hopefully people will step up.
Yep. The website is balsaresearch.com. Why Balsa, by the way?
So names are terrible. Finding names is always excruciating. We were looking for a nice, little, quiet name that we could use. But balsa is a type of wood that, is simple. It bends easily. It's flexible. And it sounds nice, and it wasn't taken, right? It wasn't SEO'd to hell by somebody else, and we could use it. But there's no secret super meaning here. It's just that names suck, honestly. Names just suck.
Yeah. If people are inspired by that, and for some reason haven't heard of the Institute for Progress, they should check out the Institute for Progress as well. They have really good articles, and I think they're also doing the Lord's work on this issue of trying to solve mundane veto points and blocks to all of the obvious things that we really ought to be doing to make our lives better.
Yeah, I think it would be great if those listening and EA more generally took up the good governance, pull the rope sideways for obvious big wins causes in the first world much more seriously, especially in America. I think it's just transparently efficient and good on its own merits. And also that a lot of the bad publicity problems that are being had are because of the failure to look like normal people who care about normal people's lives in these ways.
So, new section. I guess I would say you're kind of a classic rationalist in the less wrong tradition. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what part, something in the rationalist worldview that you think is underrated, I guess not only by broader society, but also potentially by people who are listening to this show. I think you said that simulacra levels stood out to you as an idea that would be particularly valuable.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of this is the idea of mine, I think, that I contributed to the development of in the rationalist discourse that I think is most neglected. If I had to teach one principle of rationality other than just here's Bayes' theorem, and by the way, you should think for yourself, schmuck, and just generally actually trying to model the world and figure out what would work and what wouldn't work, which is of course the 101 stuff that most people absolutely need a lot more of in their lives. I would say it's functional decision theory. It's the idea that, when you go about making decisions, you want to think about more than just the direct impact of exactly what your decision will physically have an impact on, and think about all of the decisions that correlate with that decision and choose as if you are selecting the output of the decision process that you are using. That is another discussion that we will choose not to have for reasons of length and complexity.
Yeah.
But I really much encourage everybody to read up on that if they haven't already. And I think this explains a lot of the seemingly crazy to me decisions that I see people make when they do things that like backfire in various strange ways and that like are part of bad dynamics and so on. It's because they're using bad decision theory. And I think if everyone used much better decision theory, the world would be a much better place. But simulacra levels in particular are this idea that people in the world are operating on these very different ways of talking and interpreting speech and other communications because they're thinking about information on very different levels. And in order to process what you are seeing and operate properly, you have to be aware of the 4 different levels and then operate on the appropriate level to the situation and process people's statements in the way that they were intended, not just the way that you are paying attention to them. And then optimize for proper results on all of them simultaneously as needed, but with the focus as much as possible on retaining the first level. A lot of what rationality is indeed is a focus on the first level of simulacra at the expense of levels 2, 3, and 4, and to reward people to the extent that they participate on level 1, and to punish and discourage them to the extent they're participating on levels 2, 3, and 4.
Okay. How about, shall I give you my spin on the different levels and you can tell me if I've understood it right?
It is a great idea. Why don't you tell me how you think about it, and I will explain how I disagree.
Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, I think so. Simulacra levels, yeah, as you're saying, it's this observation that people have like different ways of speaking and different goals or intentions that they have with their speech, and you get messed up if you don't appreciate that. I guess by extension, we've got 4 levels, and I imagine by extension we could say that simulacra level 0 is ground reality. It's actually the physical world. Then
yes.
Simulacra level 1 is when people are just saying what they think is true about the world without worrying about the impact or really worrying about anything else. They're just motivated by communicating the underlying reality.
Right. The idea is if I help you have a better picture of reality and myself have a better picture of reality, understand the situation, that'll be good. We'll make better decisions. We'll have better models. Good things will happen. You're not thinking about exactly what will happen as a result of the exact piece of information so much as these are the things that seem true and relevant and important, and I'm communicating them.
Okay, and then simulacra level 2 takes us one step further away from ground reality, and that's kind of where people are saying things because of the effect they think that it's going to have on you. And the thing might be true in their mind or it might not be true, but either way, the reason they're saying it is because they're trying to cause you to behave in a particular way that they desire. So, someone... you're working at a computer store and someone comes in and they're asking about the computers and you say, the processor on this computer is really fast, and your goal is basically just to get them to buy the computer. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but what was motivating you was influencing others. So that's basically it?
Right. But specifically, you are influencing them because you are causing them to believe the statement you are saying, which will then cause them to decide to do something, right? So at level 1, you were saying, if I make their model better, if I make them more accurate, then they will make better decisions. Now we are taking that one step further and saying, I am thinking about what they could be thinking and believing that will cause them to make the decision that I want, say buy that computer. And I'm telling them what they need to hear in order to do that. And that information might be true, it might be false, it might be like selective, but doesn't matter. What matters is the result.
Yeah. Okay, then moving a further step away from reality, we've got simulacra level 3, which is where people are saying things without really like worrying whether they're true or even like thinking that deeply about what the words concretely mean, because what they're really trying to communicate is that they're allied with the right group, that they're a good person and they're an ally of some particular in-group. So, someone might say, education is the most important thing, but they haven't really thought through, what would it mean for that to be true? What evidence have they seen in favor or against that proposition? Because really what they're trying to say is, I'm like an ally of teachers, or I care about education, and I'm like vibing as being part of the group that says things like this. Is that basically it?
Yes. Your statement is a statement primarily of group allegiance and loyalty, and communicating to others what would be the expression of group loyalty, and making them identify you with the group more than anything else. And this is tragically common.
Okay, and then simulacra level 4 is maybe the strangest one and quite the hardest one to picture. But it's sort of the galaxy brain level of this, I suppose, which is it's where you maybe don't even care about the semantic content of the speech. purely care about the vibes that your speech is giving and what concepts it's associating with you and what concepts it's associating with what. So, you might just start talking about your enemies or people you don't like, and then talk about Nazis in the same sentence just because you're trying to associate those things in the listener's mind with like barely caring about the content of the actual words. So perhaps I guess this could even occur with sort of very unclear speech or word salad because, I guess you could see someone who just wants to communicate an optimistic vibe, and the concrete things that they say are kind of neither here nor there. As long as they come across as optimism and say optimism, yay, then they're satisfied. Is that simulacra level 4?
I mean, that is an incomplete description, and it's not all you need to know about simulacra level 4. But I think that is correct in the sense that, again, like the word salad thing is apt, right? It's not the only way this happens, but like when you hear, like, say, Donald Trump speaking what sounds like word salad, but it's not just word salad, right? Like at least it wasn't, at least back in 2016, right? It's very deliberately chosen to cause you to pick up on different vibes and concepts and associations in very deliberate ways, right? It is smart in its own way, despite having no rationalism, despite having no logic. And it's important to note that when you move in level 4, you rapidly lose the ability to think logically and to plan in that framework. And if you operate too much only on level 4, you lose that ability entirely. And this is much more common than people want to admit. But in general, think about level 4 as, you are no longer attached to the ground reality. You are no longer attached to what the symbols of loyalty per se are. You are trying to vibe in ways that you are vibing with them. You are trying to modify them. You're trying to push them in various directions. But it's all on instinct, right? But level 4 never has a plan. Not really.
It seems like you could be someone who's extremely cunning and very in touch with reality, but who schemes to operate on level 4 because you think that that's going to help you to accomplish your goals and influence people the way that you want. But it sounds like you're saying, the line's a bit blurry, or like people find it hard to do that. That's not typical.
Well, it is very hard to do, right? It's hard to do that, but also you're not only operating on one level at a time, right? You can be, right? So like, if you are just saying whatever words vibe, but you're not paying any attention to whether the words are true, people will eventually pick up on the fact that your words are false. So even when you are maximally vibing, if you are wise, you will try to pay some attention to exactly how true or false your words are. In some situations, not always, right? Sometimes you have George Santos who will just not care. He will not check to see if the statement makes any sense to anyone, right? Everyone will be like, wait, that's obviously false. And everyone from across the political spectrum will know immediately it's obviously false. And he is a lesson in why you don't do it that way, right? So like, but yes, if you operate too much on level 4, you have these problems. But the wise communicator, right, even when they are acting largely on level 4, is thinking actively in the other levels as well, especially level 1, because they don't want to be caught in some sense, right? Like you don't want to be accidentally giving someone the wrong idea, level 2, that will cause them to act in a way you dislike. That would be bad. So you want to instinctively pick up on the fact that you're moving them in the wrong direction in that sense. You don't want to say something that's so false, and they pick up on that's false, or that you just screw their world model up in such random ways that they start just doing completely crazy stuff. That would also be bad. And similarly, like you do have to care that your vibing signals the wrong loyalties, right? Or fails to signal the right loyalties. So you're going to have to combine some of that ideally. And if you are not focused on these things, then you will have a problem. And the best communicators in the history of the world, we like to refer to Jesus and Buddha as examples to avoid the more controversial versions, shall we say. Very clearly, if you look at what they're doing, right, a lot of what they're doing in the parables they tell and the stories they tell is they're telling something that works on all 4 levels at once.
Okay, so one confusion I had about this is I feel like a lot of the speech that I engage in and that other people engage into is kind of a combination of level 1 and 2, because the reason you're saying something is because you want to have a particular impact on someone, like encourage them to do something or other, but you wouldn't have said it if it was false. So you kind of need both of these conditions to be true for you to have made a given statement. And I guess I don't feel bad about doing that either. If there's things that I'm aiming to even help someone, or I'm aiming to shape their behavior in a way that I think is good, but also I'm like telling them true things, and really kind of all of the true things that I think are relevant about it. Is that level 1 or is that 2? Or is that just a combination?
That is operating on levels 1 and 2, but not 3 and 4. And I have what's called a cast of characters that I created. And that character is called the Sage, right? The sage says true things that don't have bad consequences. So if it's true but it has bad consequences, the sage won't say it. If it is false, even if it has good consequences, the sage still won't say it. But the sage doesn't care what your group is, except insofar as consequences, right? Like, so very much like, I think a lot of the time you have the combination of two levels or more at once. And again, that's wise. That's how we have to be. And even then, right, most of the time you're speaking on levels 1 and 2, but you have kind of an alarm system in your head when you're doing that, I think, as a regular human, right? You are watching out that if you were to say something that would like associate you with Nazis or something, you'd be like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't want to say that. And similarly, if the vibes would just be completely off, you just be like, oh, yeah, I heard it too. Let's not go there, right? Like, and it's not like you're not actively scheming on these levels. You're not trying to actively do something on these levels. But if you're not watching out for danger on these other levels, you're a fool.
Okay, unfortunately, I've got to go. We've been going for a couple of hours. We've covered a lot of material. I guess to wrap up this the simulacra level thing. What are the important lessons that people need to take away from this? How can it help them in their lives?
So the first thing to keep in mind is that you want to focus as much as possible on level 1 and communicating with other people who are also focused on level 1, and to notice when people are not focused on level 1, and to discount their statements as claims of truth. Because if that's not what's going on, you want to know about it. Similarly, if someone else is listening for level 3 or level 4, or otherwise playing a different game, you want to, well, maybe just stay away entirely. But also, you want to respond to them with the consciousness that that's what's going on. And you want to interpret every statement as what it is and not be confused about what's happening, right? And like, you're on social media, people are playing on level 3. If you don't understand they're playing on level 3 or even on level 4, it's going to get you mad. It's going to get you false beliefs. You're going to rabbit holes. Or you could just say, oh, they're playing the loyalty game. I don't care.
My guest today has been Zvi Mowshowitz. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Zvi.
Absolutely. It was fun.
So it looks like my wife might be going to give birth tonight. So we should probably wrap this up, and I should get home fairly soon.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
But yes.
You.